Some might well ask, law is great, but what would you do with a corrupt or incompetent judge? He could make mistakes with impunity. He could be the weak link. Not quite, or at least not historically. A friend once showed me a Dutch painting representing the judgment of Cambyses. The scene is from the story reported by Herodotus concerning the corrupt Persian judge Sisamnes. He was flayed alive on the order of King Cambyses as a punishment for violating the rules of justice. The scene of the painting is Sisamnes' son dispensing justice from his father's chair, upholstered with the flayed skin as a reminder that justice comes with, literally, skin in the game.
And if you, like the great Persians and Cambyses the Great, the Achaemenid Empire, would like to have an understanding of the world around you, more importantly, the Lindy world, the Lindy wisdom which will last for generations, then one simply just goes to rationalvc.com, subscribes, gets exclusive content, early releases, and bonus content with newsletters, or should I say Lindy essays that follow each episode. Rationalvc.com, and you can subscribe there. So, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, skin in the game, with all these highlighted notes as per usual. What do you make of this book?
So this book is very different to his other books in the Inserto series. It is, as we were discussing before we came online and started recording, very much a collection of essays, if you will, and a method of bringing together all his main thoughts from the Inserto into one book. It's far shorter than any of his other books, if you discount The Bed of Procrustes. And it is also quite fun to read. You can tell that his writing style has emerged to this point where he's now completely free to write how he wants. And his fame, I suppose, in the literary world, but also in the investing and philosophical and risk worlds and mathematical worlds, you take all of those things together, his fame has put him in a place where he now doesn't hold anything back. Like, he just goes for people, goes for concepts, and he has zero care. And what's quite interesting is, if you follow him on Twitter, if you follow Nassim Taleb on Twitter, you may find him quite brash at times, or he'll, be quite rude, some would say. But actually, after reading this book, you realize why he acts like that on Twitter. So he's quite an interesting character, but the evolution of his character from Fooled by Randomness all the way through to this book is very clear to see, and it's actually quite an enjoyable experience.
He said on Twitter recently something along the lines of, I don't have an opinion because I'm free. I'm free because I have an opinion. And yeah, this was a brilliant book. I mean, last episode we did Anti-Fragile, roughly 4-hour episode. He said himself that was his central work. That is the book I enjoyed the most. This one, you can see it's a few years after Anti-Fragile, among the, the fame, and he was always free all these years, but among the, now you could say, even more freedom he enjoyed. I saw it more as a mishmash of essays. I mean, his books are usually a lot of essays and work put together, like he might sit in his attic in New York or wherever just writing books, but this one was more of a mishmash of essays. Like, at some part he's like, as I write these lines, I am here, or as I write these lines, I am here. Different parts of the world, different cafes, whatever. So, brilliant book, much shorter book, and it served more as, as we say, a lot of essays put together. So let's get the usual disclaimers out of the way, some preface and whatever, blah, blah, usual stuff. These are not book reviews. We just simply explore Lindy ideas, Lindy books, and find any ideas that one can apply, whether it's to business, to life, and more so incorporating our own life experiences, stories, etc. And one episode will not do these any justice. We come back to these again and again. So the idea is next episode is Bed of Procrustes, and we finish the Inserto series. After that, Poor Charlie's Almanac, and these are the Inserto series plus Poor Charlie's Almanac are the 6 books that have shaped our brand since inception, their philosophies and teachings. And then after that,
just to pause there, sorry. And just to pause there, quite interestingly, we have a surprise for the Bed of Procrustes episode that we will be doing that you'll find out about soon.
We do indeed, because the Bed of Procrustes episode is more aphorisms, and Taleb says you should not read more than 4 at a given time. We thought it would be more fun to wrap up the entire Inserto series by bringing on 2 of the biggest Inserto nerds from the internet worlds of the Inserto and doing an episode with them. So that's going to be a special episode. So yeah, we after Poor Charlie's Almanac, we're then going to cover many other hundreds or maybe thousands, forever really, other Lindy books. And occasionally, once every couple of years, we'll come back to the Inserto series and Poor Charlie's Almanac, because these books are so foundational, especially Inserto. The teachings are the type of, with every read, these are not books to be read, they are books to be studied. And with every reading, you pick up new things, especially as time passes, with increased maturity, life experience, etc. You pick up more understanding. So we'll come back again, but this is, slowly wrapping up the Inserto series. We've been working on hell of a lot of work, easily 50 plus hours on each episode, with all the reading, notes, highlight taking, preparing documents, recording, editing, post-production, blah, blah. So it's a lot of work, but, these are, I think, something along the lines of Charlie Munger said, acquisition of wisdom is a moral duty, and especially Lindy wisdom. So with all of that out of the way, do you want to maybe give a very high-level overview of the structure of this episode, and then we dive into what the book is about, and then we get into it, because this is actually, if I'm not mistaken, it is 8 books, in air quotes, I say books. So Taleb has this notion of he puts multiple books into one book. So if you're watching on video, you see my ultra highlighted copy. Within this book, he has 8 books, and within those books, he has chapters. So maybe you want to explain the structure of the episode, and then we get into it.
So this is quite interesting because it's the first time I've read a Taleb book, and I know I said this on the Anti-Fragile episode, but it's the first time I've read a Taleb book where from the outset, he makes it very, very clear what the structure of the book is, and makes it very clear what are the core concepts of the book. I think it's in his Google talk on Skin in the Game. He does a Google talk on Anti-Fragile and Skin in the Game. He might even do one on the Black Swan, I can't remember. But in the Skin in the Game Google talk, he expresses right at the beginning that he writes in a very free way. He actually writes with Skin in the Game, right? So he's writing in a way where he's thinking through complex concepts and figures out how they connect to each other, given that he kind of flaneurs his way into concepts and understanding, and then uses sort of real life risk and real life practical stuff to inform his then theoretical, writings. We'll get into that later in the episode. But why do I say this? Right on page 1 of the book, he says, Skin in the Game is about 4 topics in one. A, uncertainty and the reliability of knowledge, both practical and scientific, assuming there is a difference, or in less polite words, bullshit detection. B, symmetry in human affairs, that is fairness, justice, responsibility, and reciprocity. C, information sharing in transactions. And D, rationality in complex systems and in the real world. These 4 cannot be disentangled is something that is obvious when one has ... skin in the game. So he gives an overview of this is the structure of the book. What we're going to do, as you say, is go through book by book within the book. So there, as you say, like 8 books. So go through each book. But before we do that, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of the core concepts that emerge from those books, so that the listener and the watcher can understand kind of what are the core concepts as we're going through the book. The reason also I want to do this is because we're not regurgitating the book back to you. Another disclaimer is we definitely recommend that you go and read the book before listening to this, because this is informed by our experiences and our understanding, and we are not geniuses, and we're not going to give you all the answers. you have to go through this process of learning yourself, as Taleb talks about in both Anti-Fragile and this book. So go away, read it, and then come back to it and listen to it so that you'll get something more from the whole situation.
And as always with Taleb books, it's kind of all over the place, as in for example, we'll be discussing book 2 with you throughout the episode, and then we may jump to book 5 or vice versa. As we say, it's a mishmash of different essays. We try to stick to the chapter by chapter, but usually that's not the best way to, we're flaneuring through the book ourselves. So that's probably the best way to put it. He flaneured in writing it, we flaneur in reading it. And yeah, let's, and we'll throw out, as we typically do, get very excited with Taleb books, throw out a lot of favorite quotes and link it to our own stories as well.
So just to go back, so the core concepts I think that are covered in the book that we'll pick up on as we go through are the concept of what symmetry is. So essentially talking about skin in the game's definition and how it applies to symmetry. The second bucket is around what he terms the principal agent problem, which a lot of people who study social sciences, for example, will be familiar with, but this is a different twist to it, which is quite interesting. The third bucket is the minority rule, which is one of the best things that you can take away from this book, in my opinion. The fourth thing is how skin in the game can actually make you smarter in the sense of practicality versus theory. Then we go on to employers versus ownership. So what is the difference when it comes to skin in the game? We discuss inequality, we discuss ergodicity, and we revisit ergodicity on the basis of what we discussed in Fooled by Randomness. And then we talk about the takeaways from the book, and that can be things like investing, what does scalability and asymmetry mean, why is academia and bureaucracy a problematic thing when it comes to skin in the game, and then kind of what the ironic but effective advice from skin in the game could be if you want to take on these notions yourself. But like I said, we'll go through each of these buckets as we go through each of the books. So you'll basically be able to put everything together as we go through the book ourselves.
All right, let's start with, actually, before we even get into book 1, there's always so much value covered in Taleb's prologues, and there's a prologue part 1 and 2 here. So you've covered a high-level overview of, the 4 topics of skin in the game in this book. You've given a nice overview. Let's get into Prologue 1, where, again, we're not going to read a lot from the book, but some parts are necessary, and then we go further into it, more granular. But he says, this is Prologue 1, Antaeus Wact. Says, you cannot separate knowledge from contact with the ground. Actually, you cannot separate anything from contact with the ground. And the contact with the real world is done via skin in the game, having an exposure to the real world, and paying a price for its consequences, good or bad. The abrasions of your skin guide your learning and discovery, a mechanism of organic signaling, what the Greeks called pathemata mathemata, guide your learning through pain, something mothers of young children know rather well. And why, when he talks about contact with the earth, that's what we're referring to and why it's so important. Continuing on in Prologue Part 1, one of my favorite parts, it's actually a footnote or an asterisk. He says, if you remember actually in the last episode, Anti-Fragile, we discussed interventionists or interventionistas, which it's a whole topic of its own. We recommend you go back to that episode and listen. But it says here, interventionistas have in common one main attribute. They are usually not weightlifters, which is a very brilliant way to put it. And there are a few other things. I don't know if there's anything that sticks out to you in Prologue Part 1. I have a few things. For example, he says that while we're on intervention, the principle of intervention, like that of healers, is first do no harm. Even more, we will argue those who don't take risks should never be involved in making decisions. Further, we have always been crazy, but weren't skilled enough to destroy the world. Now we can. And then he goes on to warriors and warlords historically. So, the idea of skin in the game is woven in history. Historically, all warlords and warmongers were warriors themselves. With a few curious exceptions, societies were run by risk takers, not risk transferers. And He talks a little bit about the Persians, which he talks a lot about, which I love. And let me find the... There is no better historical evidence of an emperor taking a frontline position in battle than a Persian spear lodged in his chest. Julian omitted to wear protective armor. One of his predecessors, Valerian, was captured on the same frontier and was said to have been used as a human footstool by the Persian Shapur when mounting his horse. So this is obviously the battle of the Romans and Persians, which the Persians won. But he's giving us the example of, we talk about skin in the game. In modern day, you have these interventionistas who are sitting in the White House, sitting in number 10 Downing Street, who name your place in the West, and they have no contact with the ground, as I was explaining earlier in Prologue Part 1. They have no skin in the game, in other words, and they make decisions, and actually very timely, but Taleb wrote this book several years ago. He wrote about the ongoing 70-plus year conflict in with Israel and Palestine, and we'll get into that later, but he's talking about how the level of intervention, even if you want to talk about, Iran itself, the level of intervention around the Islamic Republic, or even the last 100 years. So a lot of this is in history. You'd have these decision makers, these interventionists on the front line. Today they sit in nice little air-conditioned offices with servants or what you will, making decisions that have no impact on them. So they're completely disconnected and have no contact with the ground or skin in the game.
Okay, so a couple of things. First, let me troll you on your pronunciation of Valerian, the Roman emperor. So
Valerian, Valerian, tomato. I know all the Persian pronunciations, which is what matters to me right now. Shapur.
The second thing is, Shapur's victory over Valerian is actually engraved in stone north of Persepolis, or Persepolis.
Close to where I was born.
Which is basically, so Shapur was a Sasanian king.
If you want to pronounce it the English way, it'll be Sasanian.
The Sassanids. It's a Sasanian rock carving. So basically, it's like, if you go there, you can see Valerian kneeling before Shapur on his horse. So it's been lodged in history. So although Herodotus told the story, or I don't know if it wasn't Herodotus, but although it's been referenced in history, the kind of stone carvings tell you a lot about that scenario. The second thing I wanted to say is the point on interventionistas. Interventionistas are the core problem that you'll find flows through this book. Interventionistas are, in particular, who you'll find in government. And he talks about this a lot in the prologue, but also across the book, around, the implications of interventionistas in the Middle East, for example, and how that's fucked up. Like, you talk about Israel-Palestine, but he also talks about Iraq and Syria, and the emergence of ISIS, etc. Libya, exactly. What's interesting is a couple of little things where he references interventionistas, but drops little hints around the issue, which is, he says, for example, he's referring to an interventionista here, he continues his practice from the comfort of his thermally regulated suburban house with a 2-car garage, a dog, and a small play area with pesticide-free grass for his overprotected 2.2 children. Why is that interesting? Is one, he's painting a really nice story, but two, the 2.2 children indicates that these interventionistas are increasing in number. And so it's going to become a bigger problem as you go down, as we go into the future. The other thing is, the final thing I'll say from Prologue One is he introduces one of the core concepts of the book, which is the Bob Rubin trade.
Yes.
The Bob Rubin trade is interesting because it refers to the former Secretary of the US Treasury, and he basically, I believe, worked for Citibank and made $120 million at Citibank. But once the financial crisis happened, I think in 2007, 2008, he just called out, that was a black swan, we couldn't see it coming, kept all the 120 million he made whilst he was in the industry at Citibank, and basically retired on a shit ton of money. That is the complete counterexample to what skin in the game is, that Taleb then continues throughout the book. He keeps referring to the Bob Rubin trade in a sense of, do not be someone who owns the entirety of your upside, but passes your downside to someone else. In this particular scenario, passing the losses, the significant losses, to Spanish grammar specialists, as he calls them, and the commoner, basically. Do not be that person. Own your upside and own your downside risk.
So the Bob Rubin trade is actually something he despises. Bob Rubin. He mentions this a lot in his talks on skin in the game, including his Google talk, I believe. So it's very fitting. He says bankers, master risk transferers. And obviously, some of the listeners may know, but I used to be in investment banking, part of the founding team for Silicon Valley Bank's UK and Europe office in my charlatanistic banking days. This was my proper job, if you want to call it in air quotes, proper job after university. And in recent years, the more I've been in tech, let's say from non-technical roles and then became technical, I'm sitting there coding in, software engineer, senior software engineer at Tesla. And some people, especially a couple of the younger guys who I got to know well and mentor them, and, I make fun of them. They tease me a little bit, and, because...
Do they tease your big head?
They do, because to them, it's like, this guy's a granddad. He's 32. These are like young guys in their early 20s. Like, this guy's a granddad. And I'm like, firstly, I'll smack you if we go into an MMA cage.
Go to HR.
It's typical Iranian uncle vibes. I'm like, MMA cage, I'll smack you, stop talking. Secondly, I'm a wheeler dealer. I'm a business guy who codes. I'm not a nerd like everyone else who's since 12 coding. So, but point being, they're like, we're confused. Why are you here? Like, as in, they're like, they've read the stories about me in banking. They read my essays. They've seen some of the photos. To them, it's still again, I put in air quotes, a high status thing. And I can't fucking wait in this episode till we get into all the chapters around, this whole notion of prestige or status, how it's all flawed. A lot of it is mimetic, to be honest. Shout out to Luke Burgess, friend of the show. A lot of this stuff is mimetic, and they're confused. Like, so why are you a software engineer here when you're like this, in their eyes, like, oh, big shot banker, and then on this nice ladder to get high titles, whatever. And I'm like, you don't understand. It's not part of my value set. As I gain some maturity, understanding of how the world works, and I realized how flawed not only the banking model is, but it's not an environment for erudition. There's no skin in the game. It's charlatanistic, as Taleb says here. They're master risk transferers. And so these guys wouldn't get it that what's wrong with the banking world. And I think some people think they understand, but until you've been in the environment, you were previously a management consultant, a senior manager for like 8 years. I was in banking for 4 or 5 years. And so we have a very good view of, this is why I think it's very fitting that we do this episode. We are previously complete opposite, and like just no skin in the game whatsoever, to now having some skin in the game and increasingly more and more. And over the years, having had a crack at some businesses, etc. So why is Bob Rubin here, this guy from Citibank, who, as you say, he collected $120 million? Why is this an issue? Well, because financial recession happened. The taxpayer essentially had to bail out all of these fucking banks. And Bob Rubin, off he goes into the sunset with his $120 million, and he doesn't have to pay it back. So Taleb says, heads, he wins. Tails, he shouts, black swan. And this is the notion of rent-seeking or rent-seeking bankers. Rent-seeking is trying to use protective regulations or rights, in air quotes, to derive income without adding anything to economic activity, not increasing the wealth of others. As Fat Tony, from previous books you may know, as Fat Tony, who will be introduced again a few pages down, would define it, it is like being forced to pay protection money to the mafia without getting the economic benefits of protection. To wrap up this monologue, but it's important to explain to young people, for the love of God, please, there should be incentives around this to stop you from going into banking, consulting, academia, environments where you're judged by your peers, IYI environments, or environments you're bailed out by the taxpayer. You need to have real contact with the ground. And Taleb does actually, even though he's not a prescriptive guy, give a few pieces of advice to young people later in this book, which we'll get onto as well. So that was it. But wrapping up part one, prologue part one, the only other thing he has is systems learned by removing. He says, now, if you are going to highlight only one single section from this book, here is the one. The interventionista case is central to our story because it shows how absence of skin in the game has both ethical and epistemological effects, i.e. related to knowledge. We saw that interventionistas don't learn because they are not the victims of their mistakes. And as we hinted with pathameta, mathameta, the Greek, the same mechanism of transferring risk also impedes learning. More practically, you will never convince someone that he is wrong. Only reality can. Actually, to be precise, reality doesn't care about winning arguments. Survival is what matters. For the curse of modernity is that we are increasingly populated by a class of people who are better at explaining than understanding, or better at explaining than doing. There is no evolution without skin in the game.
A couple of things. One, if you're new to this podcast, Cyrus will go on these random monologues that after 6 minutes of listening, you still don't know where it's going. And then suddenly, oh yeah, okay, this is where he's going. The reason we've spent so long on Prologue One is because basically the entire book gets outlined in Prologue One. Not in its entirety, but like the core concepts basically get outlined. And so Prologue One sets the scene for a lot of the references that Taleb makes throughout the rest of the book.
He also says the first 60 pages of the book really cover the central ideas.
He does, yeah. But like, if you've read Anti-Fragile, in particular Anti-Fragile, and then you read this book, this feels like an addendum to Anti-Fragile because he's basically not introducing anything new. If you haven't listened to that episode, go and listen to it because you'll see us constantly referencing back to the episode, but also you'll hear the same concepts coming up again. And also he's leveraging a lot of the concepts that Anti-Fragile is known for and just providing additional examples in this book. So you kind of get this view of like, what does anti-fragility mean in the context of today's world, which is kind of what Prologue One sets out for us. So he'll reintroduce the idea of the green lumber fallacy towards the end of Prologue One. He introduces, as Cyrus mentioned, via negativa again here. And he talks about this concept of interventionistas as being this point around people that suffer from the narrative fallacy, which was introduced originally in Fooled by Randomness and then keeps coming back here. But yeah, I think...
Yeah, I have to add the reason I've gone on this, you want to call it a rant or an extremely excited monologue the last few minutes. It's going to be a lot of this episode because for years, those who are familiar with, who read my essays or my tweets or whatever, I've talked a lot about this notion of skin in the game and my disgust with those with the least contact with the ground, so charlatan bankers, etc., as someone who was in the environment. And and wrapping up part one of the prologue, which we're still on, he says, in general, the more people worship the sacrosanct state, or equivalently large corporations, the more they hate skin in the game. The more they believe in their ability to forecast, the more they hate skin in the game. The more they wear suits and ties, the more they hate skin in the game.
I will explain exactly why actually employees have the most skin in the game, but they're perceived as submissive dogs, as Taleb puts it. But we'll come on to that.
And we'll get onto that for sure, because there's varying levels of skin in the game, and I think there's a diagram for this as well. And beyond skin in the game, then we have soul in the game, which maybe is what I should be talking more about. So semantics here, but absolutely I agree with you. But to wrap up that via negativa, which you may remember from the past book Anti-Fragile, it's the principle that we know what is wrong with more clarity than what is right, and that knowledge grows by subtraction, etc. So Prologue Part 2, if you want to kick us off.
So Prologue Part 2 is where another core concept of the book is introduced, but then again is used throughout the book, and that's the concept of the silver rule. This is where via negativa becomes sort of clearly important. The point is, if you look at the concept of symmetry, which we discussed, which I explained was one of the core concepts that we discuss, The point of symmetry is that you can own, in risk, you can own all your upside as long as you're willing to own your downside as well. The reason this feels right to humans is because it reflects something that has been part of societal construct from 4,000 years ago. And he gives the example of Hammurabi. So Hammurabi, in ancient Babylon, had a stone of laws that people could read, or in reality would be read to people given the level of literacy was quite low. And he has this table in the book called Table One, The Evolution of Moral Symmetry, where he breaks down how you get from Hammurabi to universal law today. And he says that the golden rule that, for example, Christianity was built upon is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Basically treat others the way you'd like them to treat you. But actually what's more useful is Hammurabi's law, which is essentially the negative rule, or the silver rule, if you will. And that is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but actually it's even more symmetrical than that. The laws specifically in the sort of laws of Hammurabi were, if a builder builds you a house and that house falls apart and kills you, that builder should also die. If a builder builds a house and your first son dies as a result of that house falling apart, the builder's first son should also die. Complete and utter symmetry of risk. The really interesting thing about the silver rule is it takes the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and flips it on its head via negativa. It shows the other side of the coin. That's significantly more impactful for humans because it enables an interpretation that has zero flex in it. You kind of know exactly what's going to happen. The other way of thinking about this in modern society is that you can't essentially transfer risk to anybody else. So you bear the fruits and the downfalls of all the risks that you take. An example which is pulled out throughout the book is this point around pilots. So you could be a bad pilot, but the reason you probably don't see any bad pilots in the ultimate sense, if you take it to the extreme, is because they all die. And the reason they all die is because if you're a bad pilot and you're in the air, if something goes wrong, you're going to crash and you're going to kill everyone, but you're also going to kill yourself.
Or Boeing's just shit.
Or Boeing is just shit. So this point around sharing the harm and the return is where this silver rule becomes super important. And the reason this becomes more important as the book goes on is because this concept of symmetry applies to everything, right? It's not just inconsequential fairness. It's also things as, justice is built on this logic. And he talks about tort law later in the book around, suing companies where you think they've done wrong, which actually holds companies in check, particularly in the US, where, this becomes really, really important, is as it acts as a silver rule towards large companies acting out of whack. It also applies to responsibility. It also applies to, as he says in the beginning of the book, reciprocity. So it fits very neatly into the human condition and therefore how we should build society.
So, yes, and we'll throw up Table 1, which is, if you're watching on video, if not, maybe we can link it in the show notes, but Table 1 is exactly what you've outlined. It's the evolution of moral symmetry from Taleb and Sandis from 2016. So we'll throw that up. That's an important point. Moving on within Prologue Part 2, if you want to talk about a deeper message of the book, he says, in fact, the deep message of this book is the danger of universalism taken two or three steps too far, conflating the micro and the macro. Likewise, the crux of the idea of the black swan was platonification, missing central but hidden elements of a thing in the process of transforming it into an abstract construct, then causing a blow-up.
So the final things I think he touches on is this point around how skin in the game becomes soul in the game. And he gives the example of artisans. So it's this whole point around you've got to take risks, especially risks for your opinions, and you need to be bold and public about your opinions, which explains Taleb's strategy on Twitter, if you will. And he also talks about the concept of honor. So you have to have soul by having honor, and honor is something that is kind of lost in modernity, because it would mean that there are some concepts that you should never do. There are things that you would never do. That's essentially what honor is. And in reality, in modernity, there are people that weasel their way out, particularly interventionistas, that weasel their way out of stuff by making a narrative around it after the fact and saying, oh yeah, but I had to feed my kids, or I had to send my kids to school, or, so this concept of soul in the game that builds on skin in the game is also introduced here.
A few other, just in Prologue Part 2, trying to wrap it up, a few of my favorite quotes that he discusses, which is actually one of what we discuss at Rational VC, is this notion of just be doing shit, is what we say. Taleb says, we are much better at doing than understanding. You may not know in your mind where you are going, but you know it by doing. And another favorite part from this prologue, part 2, is he talks about simplicity. And in simplicity, he says, things designed by people without skin in the game tend to grow in complication before their final collapse. When you are rewarded for perception, not results, you need to show sophistication. And what this gets at is the quote I throw about sometimes when I say perception equals reality. Where does this come from? So when I started in investment banking at Silicon Valley Bank, my first ever day as an intern, one of the managing directors, kind of said basically, he said, come here. He was just showing me a couple of things. And then he said, everything here, don't forget, everything here, perception is reality. And I was like, all right, that's it. You can kind of go now. And I was like, oh, perception is reality. What the fuck? I was in my early 20s. Like, fuck, what the fuck? As time went on, after a few months, I was like, perception equals reality. And these
Persian
environments...
uncle.
Which is a moment of you finally cracked the code or figured it out. So that's it. That's why I think such environments, not non-skin in the game people do not get simplicity. So they have to make up shit. They have to make up long PowerPoint slides. They have to give off the impression of, wearing a tie and being extra. Of course, we're all huge fans of, if you want to talk about the Lindy or classical gentleman way of dressing, of course. But to do in a daily work environment in banking, to have your Ferragamo, whatever the fuck you want to call it, tie with your Gucci loafers or your Hermes tie, and just your trips are like, it's a whole world of its own, which we'll get onto in later in the book. He talks about this consumerism and the type of expensive shit that you can just sell to stupid people. But these are people who don't get simplicity, and so they are intellectually idiots. They have to also make up a lot of this shit that seems sophisticated, but it actually is not sophisticated, just to be perceived, which is the whole notion of perception is reality. So in the investment banking or management consulting worlds, for example, this is genuinely a thing. If you are seen when you're walking around the office, let's say you need to leave your desk and go to the toilet. If you walk really fast, it's a sign of, okay, this guy's busy. Or if you carry around a notepad at all times, or if you're in early and you stay till really late, and then it's like, if you show you're always online, if you send emails at late, ungodly hours and make sure you CC your manager. Of course, to some extent, this is all corporate environments, but even more so in environments where perception is reality. So these are people with literally zero skin in the game. And yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you want to touch on in Prologue Part 2. You've touched on soul in the game, which he says, if you do not take risks for your opinion, you are nothing. And I will keep mentioning that I have no other definition of success than leading an honorable life. And you've touched on this notion of honor, via negativa, etc. So we'll get onto those more in the book. I've literally, as with all NNT books, I've highlighted every single line. So what's the point of even highlighting? But he says here, this is one of the best, my note here says one of the best pieces of advice NNT got. So what did he say? Now, something very practical. One of the best pieces of advice I have ever received was the recommendation by a very successful and happy older entrepreneur, Yossi Vardi, to have no assistants. The mere presence of an assistant suspends your natural filtering, and its absence forces you to do only things you enjoy and progressively steer your life that way. This is a via negativa approach. You want maximal free time, not maximal activity, and you can assess your own success, air quotes, according to such metric. Having an assistant, except for the strictly necessary, removes your soul from the game. Assistance moves you one step away from authenticity. So, same thing that we're discussing. And you want to talk about Silicon Valley or hotshot tech VC entrepreneurs, founders, whatever, in our niche, who are always like, yeah, speak to my assistant. These are VCs we'll also get onto later in this episode, but I think I bucket most VCs in the same category as bankers and consultants, because we've talked about this a lot. The next page, Taleb talks about a caveat with entrepreneurs, and my sticky note here says, if you're watching, it says VC-backed founders equals fraud, bootstrapped equals G's, or gangsters in other words. So Taleb here says a caveat with entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are heroes in our society. They fail for the rest of us. But owing to funding and current venture capital mechanisms, many people mistaken for entrepreneurs fail to have true skin in the game, in the sense that their aim is to either cash out by selling the company they helped create to someone else, or go public, in air quotes, by issuing shares in the stock market. The true value of the company, what it makes, and its long-term survival are of small relevance to them. This is a pure financing scheme, and we will exclude this class of people from our entrepreneur, air quotes, entrepreneur risk-taker class. This form of entrepreneurship, VC-backed founder entrepreneurship, this form of entrepreneurship is the equivalent of bringing great-looking and marketable children into the world with the sole aim of selling them at age 4. Companies beyond the entrepreneur stage start to rot, yada, yada, yada. So why is this important? And I want to get your views on this, but we've discussed this time and time again, where you want to talk about friends of the show, the Daniel Vasalos of the world, or the indie hacking community, the Peter Levels of the world, and asymmetric bets, who are completely bootstrapped. They have no external funding, whereas VCs themselves are currently frauds because they're taking heaps of LP funding, none of it theirs, living off management fees, and so many VC funds just go completely bust, made fuck all, even over 10 years, some of them. Returns are subpar. Most of them just about make 1x. Very, very few actually make over 3x if you go and read the stats. And then they just live off management fees for like 10 years. This is not like Warren Buffett's original partnership model, where there was a hurdle rate. Firstly, he charged no management fees, just like we don't at Rational.fund. Buffett charged no management fees, and then he only got carry above a certain hurdle rate. That's complete skin in the game. So VCs are frauds. They're getting all this management fees to do fuck all and get subpar returns. And then the VC-backed founders, of course, the notion of venture capital is, you're taking risks. If the idea fails, it fails. But for the 5,000th fucking SaaS app, which some bros rent out on expensive WeWork and all this shit, and then they eventually bound to fail, that's bullshit. So they're also frauds with no skin in the game, living off the funding, which the funnel of funding really just comes from pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, or whatever you want to call it. So basically, if you build a company, unless it's a deep tech company or life sciences or something that needs significant funding behind it, if you're building software or something else, venture capital is bullshit and you're a fraud. So that's that.
This is the first time he fires shots at VC, by the way. If you read his other books, he's always talking about the benefits of venture capital, and he's talking about how tech can be a product of tinkering. Yeah, let's hold that off, because he discusses this in more detail when we come to book 5. So what the prologues are doing are introducing you to all of the different concepts that emerge throughout the book, and we'll come on to that later on when we discuss book 5. The concept of what he loves about venture capital is probably stronger than what he dislikes about venture capital. But the product of where VC has ended up and how it works today around pushing the bag, leaving the final person holding the bag, is what he basically has an issue with, because that doesn't enable any skin in the game. But the core concepts of skin in the game do apply quite well to what venture capital does. So I think this is probably why it's the first time. And also, the book was written, I think, in 2016, 2017, 2018, something like that. And so that's when you start seeing the crazy fucking SoftBank money and, you know, all of the crazy tiger money that then came in afterwards. Like, this is when you start seeing the craziness of venture capital emerging as well. So he's starting to see where the system is starting to degrade, and he's calling that out, I think, as much as anything. I think Prologue Part 3 is rather simple. It's not anything in too much detail. He kind of goes through why skin in the game fits into the broader notion of the inserto. He, in fact, you know, as I've termed earlier, he does say skin in the game was a segment of anti-fragile under the banner "Thou shalt not become anti-fragile at the expense of others." So he's basically going to this point in more detail around anti-fragility and asymmetry when we get to Prologue 3, and why he holds himself to, you know, extreme account and has ultimate skin in the game for his own conscience, and why he kind of loves to make sure he's taken everything to the nth degree. So, for example, he talks about the Hammurabi Code that we spoke about in Prologue 2. He says, you know, I didn't feel comfortable writing about this when I couldn't read the script that was written in, I think it was Akkadian text on the Babylonian tablet. Not only that, I had to be able to read it. I had to read it in the right phonetic way as well. So I had to be able to say those words in the way that they were intended to be said. And so he says that, you know, I held off writing and publishing this book up until the point that I could genuinely read that myself. So he talks about the personal elements of skin in the game as well, which have helped him write this book. And then the last thing I want to say from this Prologue Part 3 is how he talks about book reviewers. And this is why we don't like going through podcasts, going chapter by chapter, book by book, and telling you everything that's in it, because you should be doing that yourself, but also because the interpretation might be misled. And this is, you know, him talking about book reviewers, where he says, many book reviewers are intellectually honest and straightforward people, but the industry has a fundamental conflict with the public, even while appointing itself as representative of the general class of readers. And then he explains why that's the case. For instance, when it comes to books written by risk takers, the general public can detect what is interesting to them in a certain account, something those in the fake space of word production chronically fail to get. And they cannot understand what it is that they don't understand because they are not really part of the active and transactional life. This is the building on that further point of practical versus theory, is that if you've not done it yourself and you then talk about it as a book reviewer, so if this, in this case, it's all about risk and asymmetry, you have no right giving your view, because in reality you haven't lived that life to give an accurate view of what it is I'm talking about. And he then goes on to say, nor can book reviewers, by the very definition of their function, judge books that one rereads. For those familiar with the idea of nonlinear effects from Anti-Fragile, learning is rooted in repetition and convexity, meaning that the reading of a single text twice is more profitable than reading two different things once, provided, of course, that said text has some depth of context. That quote is in and of itself why we study these texts, and we don't just come and make a podcast of reading the book once. We'll go through it over and over again, over time as well. So I've read this book since probably over the last 4 years. I've read this book probably 7 or 8 times, and I take something away from it every single time. I even, we'll watch his talks and his podcasts, and we'll watch other people who have spoken about his talks, like Naval on the Joe Rogan podcast. A lot of his, Cyrus and I talk about this a lot. A lot of Naval's theories and his tweets in his famous tweet storm, they all come from Taleb's views.
It's all
and so
from Taleb.
we want to take all of this stuff together and then come to an interpretation and study what's going on here. He gives all of this view, and at the end of the prologue, end of Prologue 3, he gives a table of what's no skin in the game versus skin in the game versus soul in the game looks like, and we can throw that table up for those watching or give a link to it. But he essentially finalizes by saying, here are examples of where historically and today you'll see the differences between having skin in the game, not having skin in the game, but also having soul in the game.
Yes. So I think that's a brilliant way to end the 3 prologues. And actually the 3 prologues formed the book 1. So there's 8 books in Skin in the Game. That was all book one. And I think it's very important. We spent quite a long time on it, but he says himself, the first 60 pages are actually very important of the book. So that's a great way to wrap it up. And we can get on to now book two, which is called A First Look at Agency. And, this is where he kicks off with his first chapter, why each one should eat his own turtles, equality in uncertainty. And what he's talking about here is, there's an example of, I won't go into the whole, story, but fisherman catches a bunch of turtles and he has some guests, a group invited, him to join them and offered him the turtles to eat. So detecting that he was only invited to relieve them of the unwanted food, he forced them all to eat the turtles, thus establishing the principle that you need to eat what you feed others. I think this is similar to, I don't know if you've seen this before online. There's a video of, is it Putin or someone else? What?
Well, actually, it was Kim Jong-un and Putin at a conference together, and they are both obviously aware of the dangers of taking each other's drinks, given, and we'll come on to this, the minority rule around poisoning someone. And so they're both like slowly touching each other's glasses and like watching each other to see who takes the first sip, and then neither of them takes the first sip.
Yeah. So it's exactly this idea of agency. You should be eating your own turtles if you're trying to get others to eat the turtles that you've caught. So that's an important point. I have here, beware of the person who gives advice telling you that a certain action on your part is good for you, in air quotes, while it is also good for him, while the harm to you doesn't directly affect him. So that is one of the most important points in this book, actually. You can give advice or you can sell by, let's say, advertising the quality of the product, and the two need to be kept separate. Maybe you want to touch on this a little bit as well, and some of your points in this chapter.
So the first thing that gets introduced in this chapter is, or in this book I should say, is the principal agent problem, which, as you describe, this point around eating your own turtles, unless you want God to come down and strike you for giving him an offering, which are these disgusting turtles. But the point that comes from and builds on what you spoke about is the notion of bad incentive design is essentially introduced here. You cannot separate the fruits of your labor from labor itself. And that is why, for example, I think it's in this section, but it might be later on in the book, he talks about Caesar and Napoleon, and he even talks about Alexander the Great, whereby if you want something done, go and do it yourself. In the context of war, for example, you'd want to be on the front line. You'd want to be the one going and fighting. And that gives you a direct amount of skin in the game that removes the principal agent problem. And he gives a great quote here. He says, "Avoid taking advice from someone who gives advice for a living unless there is a penalty for their advice." It's essentially just saying, like, it's building on this point of symmetry that we spoke about around the Hammurabi concept and the silver rule. If you're going to have some level of skin in the game, you have to bear the fruits and the downsides of your labor as well. I think that's the main thing that gets introduced here. But he also does start to provide a view of collectivism and scalability, which we'll come on to later. He starts to discuss this point around why the notion of the smallest or the self can be scaled further, and the outcomes and systems that sit around those things completely change in a dynamic fashion as you grow. So the collective will think very differently to the individual, which he references Ostrom and his tragedy of the commons that he discusses. But we can come on to more of that detail later. And he also discusses something, the final thing I just want to say about this chapter is this point around where the principal agent problem becomes interesting is talking one's book. you'll hear a lot of venture capitalists, Chamath, David Sachs,
Techno Watermelon,
and J Cal and a lot of the guys on the Olympod use the quote "talking one's book." You'll hear a lot of poker players talk about talking up one's book. The thing that's interesting here is he says the quote, and he's said this in Prologue One, but he repeats it here. Don't tell me what you think. Tell me what you have in your portfolio. Don't tell me what you think. Tell me what you have in your portfolio. The point here is that if you have an opinion about something, you should be also taking action on that opinion, ideally before you even give that opinion in the first place, because you are now holding both the upside and the downside of that risk publicly. He talks about, for example, going on I think it was a CNBC or CBC or CNN show or something, where he talks about where everybody is talking about the Microsoft stock, and the camera turns to him and is like, all right, so what do you think about Microsoft? And he's like, I don't have it in my portfolio, and I'm not even like shorting this stock, so I have no opinion. And everyone's like, what the fuck do you have no opinion? Like, you should have an opinion. And he's like, I haven't looked into it, and I haven't bought anything around it, and I'm not invested in it, so why should I talk about it? And so this, understanding this concept is important, because the final point, if you can identify a conflict of interest that emerges from someone talking up their book, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have skin in the game. It just means that they are potentially understanding the skin in the game that they do have, and they should therefore make it clear that they have a conflict of interest. He says, in general, skin in the game comes with conflict of interest. What I hope this book will do is show that the former is more important than the latter, i.e. having skin in the game is more important than having a conflict of interest. There is no problem if people have a conflict of interest if it is congruous with the downside risk for themselves. So skin in the game trumps everything. Talking up one's book is great, but as long as you have skin in the game and you are being very clear that that is your conflict of interest, it comes before everything. Skin in the game, if you break it down further, is all of these points around symmetry that we spoke about, but it's also honor and courage. And this is where he then lays the foundation for the rest of the book, where he starts to discuss the more complex concepts.
So there's two key parts I want to cover. One is, so the quote that I said is actually very important, and I'll say why. I'll repeat it again, where he says, beware of the person who gives advice telling you that a certain action on your part is good for you, air quotes, while it is also good for him, while the harm to you doesn't directly affect him. And then further on, he talks about the sort of, if you want to talk about the danger of the typical salesman or salespeople, they are experts in the art of psychological manipulation, making the client trade, often against his own interest, all the while being happy about it and loving them and their company. So a lot of sales situations are where it's good for him, the salesman, he makes money out of you, while the harm to you doesn't directly affect him. So it could be a defective car. There could be, and I think Taleb here also talks about, obviously a lot of this is around ethics and transparency. And so in many sales situations, even if you want to talk about investment banking, you want to talk about VCs, or you want to talk about people who dump on retail investors, a lot of the hidden things around these companies with huge flaws, whether it's stocks they're dumping, whether it's products people are selling, there are so many hidden things in so many transactions. And unfortunately, maybe I wouldn't call it pessimism, but more skepticism. There is a huge lack of transparency in many aspects of commerce in modern day in the world, which leads to suboptimal outcomes. And so this is what Taleb says we need to be aware of. And then he goes on to say, so air quotes, giving advice as a sales pitch is fundamentally unethical. Selling cannot be deemed advice, which is, what I mean when I say you can give advice or you can sell by advertising the quality of the product, and the two need to be kept separate. But when a salesman is saying, yes, come here, this is good for you, this product, my friend, and all of this typical kind of stuff, which, I mean, you hear that in third world countries or in bazaars in the Middle East, but in modern day Western corporate world, It's actually, they do it the exact same, but it's actually more disguised. And a wonderful quote, I don't have the exact quote, but a wonderful quote by Curtis Jackson, Mr. 50 Cent, who he's talked about in the streets, they actually they have the, he didn't say honor, I can't remember the exact quote, but he said at least they have, you know, some level of honor, or at least they show you the gun before they shoot you, right? He says in the corporate world, it's all they fuck you through the contracts and all the hidden things, and they shake your hand and look you straight in the eye, and they pretend all is well. But that's the nature of when we're talking about this typical salesman. You may be picturing a guy in a bazaar, but no, actually a lot of it we're talking about in these corporate environments, in the Western world, in venture capital, in tech, etc. And so ethics is, as you mentioned, you touched on it as well, but ethics is absolutely paramount to this. The ethic, he says, the ethical is always more robust than the legal. Over time, it is the legal that should converge to the ethical, never the reverse. Laws come and go, ethics stay. And so a core concept of the book that he says himself is the asymmetry, let's say, in transactions. He says, which brings us to asymmetry, the core concept behind skin in the game. The question becomes, to what extent can people in a transaction have an informational differential between them? And the ancient Stoics used to say, if a man knowingly offers for sale wine that is spoiling, ought he tell his customers? As a question. The world is getting closer to the position of transparency, not necessarily via regulations as much as thanks to tort laws and one's ability to sue for harm in the event a seller deceives him or her. Recall that tort laws put some of the seller's skin back into the game, which is why they are reviled, hated by corporations. So if you want to call it skepticism that I mentioned earlier, of course, one should be skeptical, especially in no skin in the game in corporate environments such as VC, banking, consulting, etc. But as Taleb says here, thanks to tort laws, I would say maybe in more skin in the game type of products, etc., we are slowly converging. Maybe there is some hope in the world after all. The last thing I'll wrap up this section with is, he says, no person in a transaction should have certainty about the outcome while the other has uncertainty. And he talks about qarar, which we have in Farsi or Persian as well. Qarar is like a arrangement, agreement, kind of a plan, which, you know, he says here has, like every legalistic construct, will have its flaws. As we see, the problem of asymmetry is so complicated that different schools give different ethical solutions. And he also says, let us look at the Talmudic approach, and Jewish ethics on the matter is closer to Antipater than Diogenes in its aims at transparency. So the whole notion of, we talk about asymmetry here, we're talking about the asymmetry of one party having an informational asymmetry over the other, i.e. they know that something in the product is not good, but they sell it to you. There's no ethics or transparency. It benefits them, but the harm that it causes you does not harm them, and that's also a no skin in the game approach. So
there's one last thing which builds on your ethical point from book 2 that's important, where he talks about the intersection between what's to come, which will be the minority rule and what we talk about asymmetry in book 3, and what he's discussed so far, which is this point around where ethics trumps everything. And he says there is a limit from scaling beyond which the rules cease to apply. The general kills the particular, he sees. We'll explain why that's the case in a second. But the reason this is important is whenever the we becomes too large a club, things degrade and each one starts fighting for his own interests. The reason this is important is because ethics changes as you scale. We'll explain why that is shortly. And as a result, socialists or communists who believe that the individual can be subject to the same psychological, philosophical notions when you scale up to the combined, community, are wrong. And in fact, this specific thing is what spurred my thought around why socialism succumbs to the breakdown between universality and ethics. And as a result, what you come away with after reading this section, for me personally, was two major things. The first being that, being a middleman, be it a salesman, being an interventionista, being it an administrator, will always have issues with skin in the game related to it. You're not necessarily always going to have skin in the game because you're put in a place where information asymmetry becomes your job. And that's dangerous. He talks about, for example, doctors, patients, and then the administrators that sit between them. And the second thing that you come away with is this point around identifying how ethics is important in the context of skin in the game, and how ethics has problems when it gets to scaling, which is then what emerges in book 3.
Yes, and one of my last points I want to touch on in this book 2, or A First Look at Agency, is he talks about, he says, and I'm trying to link this to my experience, he says, but we don't have to go very far to get the importance of scaling. You know instinctively that people get along better as neighbors than roommates. When you think about this, it's obvious, even trite, from the well-known behavior of crowds in the anonymity of big cities compared to groups in small villages. I spent some time in my ancestral village where it feels like a family, yada, yada, yada. And I think this links to my kind of having been, raised in London, lived in London for most of my life. Even though it feels truly like home, but my obsession with cities or places, like I wouldn't even call them cities, somewhere like Munich, where the Germans say Munich is not a city, it's a big village. And so if you look at the crime statistics of, European cities, Munich is not only top 10 safest cities in the world, but I think number 1 or 2 in Europe, which is considered a city, but it's kind of a big village. And that's on the scalability point that he touches on. And there's kind of more, you want to call it agency, which is what this whole book 2 is about. You're more anonymous in a city like London. Unfortunately, cities like, for other reasons too, of course, but cities like London and New York, they're seeing an upsurge in crime, and there's not this notion of looking out for your neighbor, you want to call it, which is not just referring to your actual neighbor, but in places like Munich, I know of people who lose items and it's immediately given to the lost and found, or they hold on to it, like, come and get it, I'm waiting here, I can give you your thing. So hopefully this continues, maybe not for long with the way Europe's changing, but that's, I guess, partially my fanaticism or obsession with a place like Munich, someone who's been in London most of his life.
And now let's take a break, and we'll come back after the break and discuss book 3. All right, we're back from the break. Time to discuss book 3 in Nassim Taleb's Skin in the Game. What do you think of this book?
What do you think makes a great project manager?
Wait, do you want to explain where that comes from?
Do I know the
Have
full
we explained it on previous pods where it comes from?
No. So whenever one of us says, "What do you think?" What do you think?
We don't say it like that, bro. What do you think makes a good project manager?
What, like, we'd be in a serious discussion. We'd be like, okay, so what do you think about this VC investment? What do you think about this podcast recording software? And then Iman or I would quickly say to the other one, what do you think makes a good project manager? And that comes from our dear friend who's Arya, who he was explaining a story maybe 10 years ago. He had just left university.
I think it was like 15 years ago.
One of your relatives, actually, who has been in the tech industry for a long time.
Family friend
was giving our friend Arya advice about careers in tech. And he was on the phone, typical 60-plus Iranian guy with a heavy Persian accent.
Basically, Arya was getting advice from someone who's been in the game a long time, right? And then he's explaining to Arya, like, oh, here are all the questions they could ask you in an interview. And then he's like, one of the questions is like, how do you think you'd perform as a project manager? Like, what are the concepts that make a good project manager good? And then he was like, but what I like to do when they ask me this question is flip it on them and tell them, what do you think makes a good project manager?
That's the one. That's the exact one.
Okay, so what do you think makes a good project manager?
All right, what do I think of book 3? That greatest asymmetry is what it's called. And so here Taleb goes into a few things. Studying individual ants will almost never give us a clear indication of how the ant colony operates. So he talks here, parts and whole differ because what matters are the interactions between such parts, and interactions can obey very simple rules. The rule we discuss in this chapter is the minority rule, the mother of all asymmetries. Do you want to go into, I know you mentioned it early in the podcast, the minority rule, and give a couple of examples?
Let's do it. So the minority rule is the most novel thing I took away from this book when I first read it like 4 or 5 years ago. And the minority rule is as follows. In any society, you'll have an intransigent group and a flexible group. An intransigent group being a group that is inflexible. But the thing with the intransigent group is the reason they are intransigent or inflexible is because they have significant skin in the game. So what ends up happening is that the larger group, i.e. the flexible group that is in the majority, tends to submit itself to the will of the smaller minority group. I know this sounds counterintuitive when you first hear it, but actually it's definitely the case. And he gives millions of, you could find millions of examples, and he gives loads of examples in the book. But here's a couple examples. The first is, why do you not find peanuts on airplanes, for example? Not everyone has a peanut allergy. But in fact, what you'll find is that in order to provide the minority, with those with peanut allergies, with a safe environment, the majority will be okay with not having peanuts on a flight. Another example is, he talks a lot about GMO and non-GMO crops, and that makes sense because he had a run-in with Monsanto, which is a big ag company, as he calls them. But put GMO aside because it's rather complex, but talk about veganism. When you go to a barbecue, right, and you know that one person coming is a vegetarian or a vegan, what do you tend to do? Do you tend to make, a meat-based diet, a meat-based menu, and a vegetarian menu? Or what do? You could either do that, or you could have one vegan or vegetarian menu that everybody can eat. Typically, what I do is I make both because veganism is bullshit. But
I'll tell you what I do. I was going to say, I literally grab them by the back of their collar, pick them up, take them to the front drive, 1 millimeter on the edge of the front drive curb, and then I give a Muay Thai kick and kick them off the curb. But please continue. What do you do?
Why do you do a Muay Thai kick and not an Iranian uncle up the bum? The point is, if you're a normal person and not like Cyrus with a big head and zero, actually you are the minority. You are the intransigent group that cannot be moved.
Chucks.
But we're getting down a philosophical rabbit hole here. The point is that typically what you'll do is you'll bend your will to accommodate that person. So for example, another good example that follows diets is typically when you see a young member of a family, like a young daughter or a young son, jump on the veganism wave, they'll immediately try to get everyone in the family to abide by their rules because they're offended by anybody else eating meat in the family. And so typically what happens is one person becomes vegan and then that spreads around the entire family so that the intransigent group wins. One more example before I shut up is the concept of kosher or halal food. In the UK, a lot of our meat, he discusses, I don't know if this is still the case, but a lot of the meat imported from New Zealand is halal.
A lot of the lamb, yes.
All of the lamb, sorry.
Yes,
and the point is that if you think about the population of Muslims in the UK, it's probably no more than 3 or 4% he describes in this book. Maybe it's a little bit higher now, but
little bit.
But the point is that you go to a KFC, there might be halal KFCs, even though there's only 3 or 4% population of them. So what the point of the minority rule is, typically, even though it's counterintuitive, the most intolerant wins. And there is a point to that because the minority is always going to be around 3 or 4%, let's say. And so you're never going to be able to take over an entire system. But there are ways in which the requirements and the inflexible requirements of the minority get pushed through onto a larger group.
Exactly. And the only other example that is somewhat relevant is Taleb talks about he was at a barbecue with a lot of friends, and one of the Jewish guests had a drink from the lemonade, and I think Taleb was initially a bit shocked or worried, and then the other guy said, "Don't worry, it's kosher." And so Taleb picked up the lemonade, and on the bottom there's a letter U circled, which indicates it is literally kosher. And Taleb says, why? Simply because going full kosher allows the producers, grocers and restaurants to not have to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher for liquids with special markers, separate aisles, etc. A kosher or halal eater will never eat non-kosher or non-halal, but a non-kosher eater isn't banned from eating kosher. So for the most part, except for, I think a few years ago in England, a few of the, shall we say, more UKIP type of Brits were quite outraged when they found out that the Subway meat they were getting was halal meat. And they were outraged. I think they kind of reacted as if it's going to poison them or something. But yeah, for the most part, what Taleb says holds true. And I think he mentions that somewhere in a different way himself. This is all about what he's explaining here, what Iman has explained about the minority rule, what I've just said with this kosher lemonade example. It's all about asymmetry and choices. An honest person will never commit criminal acts, but a criminal will readily engage in legal acts. So, it's not a criminal will do a lot of legal things and then the occasional fucked up thing, whereas an honest person will never commit criminal acts. So it's somewhat, the asymmetry mirrors that of, let's say, the kosher example we gave or the halal example.
He gives so many examples in this section, you could tie on a lot of them. But the one I found really interesting that ties into book 7, which we'll come on to later, is this point around religion and the intolerance of certain religions, meaning that they spread as wide as they do. So he gives the example of Christianity. In ancient Rome, there was this practice where when you take over a new country or a state, countries as in and of themselves are a sort of 18th century phenomenon, but we can get into that separately. When they would open relations with another part of the world, there was this practice of sharing gods. So you would give one god for a Roman god to be given back to you to show that we are open and we're able to live together. And it's really an offering of peace, as it were. The Christians never did this. So the Christians, because there is only one God and Jesus Christ is his savior, were able to say, you know what, we're not going to give you our God because we don't want your pagan God in return. That is highly intransigent. They were completely inflexible in that scenario. And what did that do? That meant that the Romans were like, yo, what the fuck? This is like completely against our tradition. What are you trying to do? What do you think makes a good project manager? So they ended up in this situation where the intransigence of the Christian people meant that the Romans had to react. And what you hear, and this is talked about earlier in the book, and in fact it's the concept that we've raised in Anti-Fragile, and it's been written about by the historian Neil Ferguson, which is that the narrative fallacy means that when the winners write history, history is written by the winners, we all know that, typically what that ends up doing is creating a false or alternative reality to what actually happened. And so what we hear from Taleb here, as a Christian himself, he says, the minority rule applied here, but the story was told from the perspective of the Christians who paint the Romans as evil. Whereas in fact, the Christians were the intransigent group that you could argue caused their own demise, caused the demise of the Romans, but caused the demise of those early Christians, such as Jesus Christ himself. But then that brings in the story of honor and courage and giving yourself up for the larger whole, which we'll come on to again later on, which is why he likes religion. But anyway, the point is that intransigence can be both positive and negative in the current scenario, and then it can change over time as well.
Yes, another couple of quick examples of this intransigence that you talk about. So in Germany, he says if a meeting is taking place in Germany, and they're Germans in a corporate environment, and one of the persons in the room doesn't speak German, the entire meeting will be run in English. And of course, this is another asymmetry. And another example he gives, which I have to, it's rude not to, he talks about Persians spreading Aramaic as a language. So it was the Persians who speak an Indo-European language who spread Aramaic, the language of Assyria, Syria, and Babylon, Persians taught Egyptians a language that was not their own. Simply when the Persians invaded Babylon, they found an administration with scribes who could only use Aramaic and didn't know Persian. So Aramaic became the state language. If your secretary can only take dictation in Aramaic, Aramaic is what you will use. And so that's another example. And we also talk about, Taleb says, all it takes is, say, a 3% minority for Merry Christmas to become Happy Holidays. And then, I've seen more and more in recent years, especially in business context and emails around the December time. I hear Happy Holidays a lot more than Merry Christmas. So for the benefit of that minority, as you say, that then becomes the norm. So, yeah, I think that has been a good summary. If there's anything else you want to cover off in this chapter?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So as we learnt about in The Black Swan, and you can listen to that episode here, the interesting thing is that you have different environments where different things can be true. So we talked about extremistan versus mediocristan, which you can go and figure out what that means from reading that book and watching our podcast. The same thing applies to the minority rule. In certain environments, the minority rule works, and in certain environments it doesn't. So he gives the example of languages versus genes. So to that point around the Persians spreading Aramaic, which wasn't their first language, languages can spread via the minority rule, right? Because they are relatively intransigent, right? You can't have someone, learn something new that quickly. But the genes follow the majority rule because they're less able to travel. So what he means by that is it's very hard to change the genetic makeup of humans over a short period of time. It requires many hundreds or thousands of years for that gene pool to spread. And so you can find distinctions between what minority and majority rule is by looking at where that thing, or where the domain is where that thing applies. So it can work in things like diet, for example, but necessarily there are certain areas where it doesn't work, one being genetics. And then the final thing I'll say from this part is this point around where intransigence ends or intolerance ends and how people react to it. He talks about the decline of the West, for example, Western principles, and how you go against the minority rule in certain situations is by being intolerant yourself as the majority. So there has to be a point at which you have to exercise intolerance in order to reduce the intolerance of the intransigent group. He says, so we need to be more than intolerant with some intolerant minorities. Simply, they violate the silver rule. It is not permissible to use American values or Western principles in treating intolerant Salafism, which denies other people's right to have their own religion. So he's talking about where the minority rule impedes on your majority values and principles, you have to make a stand and you have to be intolerant yourself.
This is such a crucial point and very timely, even though we like to discuss only Lindy ideas and Lindy books. But let me give you, as an exception, a current example to paint the picture. So the exact thing you've just read, I had underlined and I was going to read too. And I have a note here that says current problems in Germany. It goes both ways. So in the past few weeks, there's been an uproar in Germany because there are videos that have surfaced online from, you want to call it the, you have your typical members clubs Germans attend, and young Germans who come from families that are leaving them large inheritances, let's say, who don't really do much other than lounge around and go to members clubs. They were listening to a song, and it's kind of it's a pretty well-known house song currently. And over this song, they were singing in German, Germany for Germans, foreigners out. And of course, they were extremely cheery and doing all sorts of whatever. And there's been an uproar in Germany. The German government is saying, it's essentially those people have all lost their jobs, by the way, because these videos surfaced online from these parties, just random young people. And they've all lost their jobs. They've been suspended from university. All sorts of stuff has happened. And the German government has clamped down and said this will not be tolerated in Germany. And then everyone else is saying, But hang on a minute. What about all of the extremists that Germany has let in, and those, exactly as you say, like Salafism, which denies other people's rights to have their own religion? So people are bringing their own, beliefs into Germany, and they're trying to force that upon Germany. It's like, if you don't like it, it's a classic saying of as the UKIP guys say back in English, if you don't like it, mate, go back to where you come from. So it's a tricky subject, but it's tricky exactly for the reason you outlined towards the end of your point, which is it's so important to kind of clamp down on things like this. Now, it's a touchy subject, but I'm trying to paint the picture of the example. I actually think Germany now is in a fucked up state and is continuing on this trajectory. Why? Simply because the reason these young Germans have kind of had enough, and I kind of understand their point. I mean, we're products of immigration. You know, your parents came to England. I came to England as a 5-year-old. But the West, I feel like, was more tolerable to immigrants. But when the West got too lax, and you can essentially say open borders at this point, and let everyone in, to the point where it's kind of like you want to call it a black market. There's no trace of many people within these countries that are causing all sorts of crimes and trying to force their fundamentalist values and beliefs on other people. Then I understand why a lot of these people are having an uproar. These young people are saying, foreigners get out, as much as we're foreigners. So it's a touchy subject. Of course, I'm not going to get into the immigration topic because you need skilled immigration. That's how America has been built. But the point is not about immigration. The point I'm trying to raise is exactly as you said. Germany is making a mistake. They should be doing what you said, which is when the minority, so the minority, let's say Salafism or people with these fundamentalist views, or trying to say you must all, we deny your religions, you must follow our religion. This will only continue, and it's going to get worse in Germany and in some Western nations, as we're currently seeing a decline. And so the German government should maybe give a little slap on the wrist to these people, maybe behind closed doors, but not publicly shame them, and should also have initiatives and things about controlling more so their country with skilled immigration rather than opening the floodgates to anyone and everyone. Some people should be let in, sure. Maybe they've been the product of extreme turmoil or whatever. It's down to them. I'm not in politics. I'm not in government. But the point is, Germany, UK, Western nations, because they're not clamping down, the minority is rising. And I'm very worried about the future of these nations because they're not doing what you just said, basically.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's where the minority rule can be flipped on its head, and you can have negatives and positives of both of them. But you can essentially leverage the minority rule to your benefit if you do it in the right way as the majority. So it doesn't always have to take over. And then, of course, there's the domains point around it. It applies in some domains, but not in others.
Yep.
Just one last thing on Book 3 before we move on. Another concept is introduced at the end of Book 3, and it also comes up in the appendix to Book 3 mostly, which is this point around the minority rule and skin in the game actually making you smarter. So he references, this whole point that we're about to get onto around scalability as well. But he references the researchers Danan J. Goad and Xian Sundar came to a surprising result in 1993. You populate markets with zero intelligence agents, that is, buying and selling randomly under some structure such as a proper auction process, matches bids and offers in a regular way. And guess what? We get the same allocative efficiency as if market participants were intelligent. So the reason this is important and requires its own separate section, even though it sits within Book 3, is because in order to learn and in order to become smarter, you need to have some skin in the game in what it is that you're doing. He says that, he was a trader before he understood complex statistics or mathematics. Even though he's kind of really good at that stuff, he first was a trader, understood the risks, and bore the pain, both the upside and the downside of risk when it came to trading. As a result, he was able to have skin in the game when it came to understanding mathematics. Why? If you're a shareholder in a company, you're going to be way more incentivized, you're going to have way more skin in the game to read the financial statements of that company and even go as far as reading the footnotes where all of the information actually lies. And he loves
learning
that.
accounting.
Exactly. And he loves that because what he's saying is that two things. One, you can become smarter by learning if you have skin in the game. But two is that at the group level, the dynamics that start emerging, the dynamics around intelligence that start emerging are different to the dynamics that apply on the individual level, which we can get onto shortly when he talks about sort of the next few books. But I found that to be really, really interesting. And I felt like he didn't spend enough time on this concept in this specific part of the book. I would have really liked it if he kind of went into a little bit more detail.
Okay, so let's get on to book 4, which is, we're nearly halfway. Book 4 is Wolves Among Dogs. And in this, this is one of the chapters which I said I'm going to talk a lot about because...
You know what's funny is that he talks a lot about every fucking chapter, so strap yourselves in for 40 minutes of non-stop chatting.
Strap yourselves in. So we're getting into book 4, Wolves Among Dogs. And yes, I'll try not to talk too much, but this chapter gets me so excited. Chapter 3, How to Legally Own Another Person. And you've heard me talk a lot about the corporate world, charlatanistic industries like investment banking, management consulting, etc. He talks about the fuck you money equivalent. Ironically, by being beggars, they had the equivalent of fuck you money, which we can more easily get by being at the lowest rung than by joining the income-dependent classes. So, this chapter is about the question of employees and the nature of the firm and other institutions. How do you own these people? First, by conditioning and psychological manipulation. Second, by tweaking them to have some skin in the game. Forcing them to have something significant to lose if they disobey authority. Something hard to do with gyrovag beggars who flout their scorn for material possessions. In the orders of the mafia, things are simple. Made men, that is, ordained, can be whacked if the capo suspects a lack of allegiance, with a transitory stay in the trunk of a car and the guaranteed presence of the boss at their funeral. For other professions, skin in the game comes in more subtle forms. And, this is talking about the... Okay, actually, maybe you want to chime in a bit here before I... What do you have to say about this chapter?
This chapter is really interesting because it introduces the idea of renting versus owning. So this is the point around if in some scenarios renting always works, in some scenarios owning always works. And this is complicated if you think about it through the concept of a contractor versus an employee. So he talks about, someone setting up a business. Well, that gives you a lot of skin in the game. That's great. But if you're doing a business in the wrong way and you're hiring only contractors because it's the most efficient thing to do, you end up hiring a contractor who is less dependable than someone who has more skin in the game, which is an employee, particularly if you can find subtle ways of giving that employee more skin in the game. That could be through like performance-based bonuses, for example. And so what you get with an employee, which I'll let you get into in more detail, is this combination of subtle elements of skin in the game because they're highly dependent, but also that's built on a fragile foundation, which is their dependence on living a lifestyle that either they cannot afford or keep up with, and therefore are reliant on this job, and also given the fact that they're kind of mentally locked into a way of thinking that they can't get out of because they're stuck in this hedonic treadmill, and thereby by creating these platonic ideals of what they think is true in the working environment, things like, for example, oh, my boss loves me, no one else could do this job, if I left, this company would go to shit. These are all made up stuff. Like you do. So what he terms them as is submissive dogs. Why is this really, really interesting? Submissive because they take your direction. Yes, they're highly dependable, but they take your direction. And dogs, because dogs are highly loyal. Dogs are beyond what a human loyalty would look like. And therefore, they're stuck to this business. From the perspective of someone who owns a business, you want submissive dogs working for you because they're highly dependable. But from the perspective of the employee, you may have skin in the game, but it's in the wrong way.
Exactly. And by being an employee, you signal a certain type of domestication, as you say. Someone who has been employed for a while is giving you strong evidence of submission. Evidence of submission is displayed by the employees going through years depriving himself of the personal freedom for 9 hours a day, every day. His ritualistic and punctual arrival at an office, his denying himself his own schedule, and his not having beaten up anyone on the way back home after a bad day. He is an obedient, housebroken dog.
You know what's funny? Okay. The funny thing here is that I know from when you were in banking, because Cyrus went through this phase, what we call banking Cyrus, where he was like intolerable when it came to us, because he was putting on this fake notion of who he was when he was in banking around the people that he worked with. So you know this point where he says, and having not beaten up anyone on the way back home after a bad day, you were probably just
Arthur meme. You know the Arthur meme. He's clenching his fist. He wants to punch them. If you're watching, we'll throw it on the screen. It's a cartoon of Arthur, the cartoon, where he's clenching his fist. He wants to punch someone in the face, but he can't, or he doesn't.
The thing is, the reason I bring it up is because you weren't able to do it, but I'm sure like us as your mates were getting the brunt of some of this as well, where you were just like vexed and mad about everything, and you would just let it loose on us because you're bottling up that shit by being in the corporate world.
Yeah, my early 20s was a miserable time, but you know, it's a positive stressor, I would say, in shaping. It gave us a lot of positive.
It gave us a lot of content. I'll tell you that much. There's our WhatsApp and I don't know, all these different groups, our Signal groups have a lot of videos of Cyrus back in his banking days because he was top quality content.
All right, so moving on. Why is this so? Okay, we're talking about employees signaling a certain type of domestication. It's very important. You know, you're losing your freedom for 9 hours a day every day. Friend of the show, Daniel Vassallo, he talks about, and so does Vizzy Andre. These are names that continuously keep coming up. Why? Because we overlap in many beliefs and values about life and business and how the world should, how one should, you know, operate in life. And those guys talk about the same, you know, this whole every fucking day, 9 to 5, same place, same time. Most jobs, most of you who are in the corporate world or have been in the corporate world know that many days you turn up, you're not doing anything. Or you're doing something, but it's so meaningless and pretend that it's just bullshit. Which goes to the notion of bullshit jobs, book written by an LSE professor. So the world doesn't work this way. We mentioned this, I believe it was in the Anti-Fragile book, where some of the best authors for 300 days a year do nothing, but for 60 days write, and they become many bestsellers. We're not being fooled by randomness here. We're just giving one example of many. This can be applied to any field, industry, or job. But you're being paid for your judgment, and you develop better judgment in idleness, in quiet time. Or it's very trite to say, but as Ryan Holiday's title of his book suggests, stillness is the key, right? So this whole thing of 9 to 5 every day, it's not only impairing your judgment or your creativity, it's just fucking up your life. Like, you get home, you're so angry, you like, I don't know, corporate, not every corporate guy, but the corporate guys will go home, shout at their kids. The whole home life is a mess. So many guys I knew in investment banking had multiple divorces, don't really speak to the kids. So this is not just about business or whatever. It's about a way of life. It's about principles. And he gives an example of, you know, let's say you want to, I don't know, you run a travel or events company and you want to fly dozens of people or 60 people or whatever to Munich in October for Oktoberfest. And the way your company works, your airline company, you typically hire pilots who are contractors, and you have a clause which says, you know, if you don't turn up for this contract job, you get a penalty. Well. The pilot coming up to Oktoberfest gets a huge job from some Saudi prince who will pay him something like 10x to take the guests to Vegas. And so your contracted pilot will break your contract and pay you the penalty because it still makes a lot more financial sense to take the Saudi money for his job. And this is talking about, why it's better to have an employee as an employer, why it's better to have someone as an employee, even though a lot of the time you may not need them. They're sitting around, they're being idle, they're not doing shit. I've experienced this in corporate world. I mean, in the corporate companies I've been in, they've been some of the fastest growing companies in their industries. So SVB in banking, Tesla in tech, etc. But even those companies at times have had downtimes where for a few days I may have been like twiddling my thumbs, but they've kept me on the payroll. Why? Because it's cheaper to do that than to get a contractor who then may just not turn up or be like, I'm leaving or I'm sick. And then secretly they've taken another job and they've just not turned up or something like that. So, and this idea of the company man, I think you slightly touched on this, but this idea of a company man is sort of gone. And he has been replaced by the company's person. For people are no longer owned by a company, but by something worse. The idea that they need to be employable. The employable person is embedded in an industry with fear of upsetting not just their employer, but other potential employers. This is one of the most dangerous things. And, people who stay in the same career or industry, we're seeing now in tech a lot of layoffs, people who have done like 20 years at some tech company or 10 years at Oracle or Google or whatever, and they're laid off and they're just lost. They're complete lost dogs. They don't know what to do because they've not developed any other skills. They kind of become useless to other companies now because they've tried to be a company's person. Well, actually, they've been a company man, but now they try to be a company's person because they're still obsessed with this idea that they need to be employable. So they try to go to another big tech company or another corporation, but they struggle. Or even if they get a job, then the other company kicks them out because it's no longer stay for 40 years, get a gold watch at the end. It's a case of every few years, either we kick you out or whatever. It's just the nature of the game now. And so this is the danger. I don't know what you want to add here before I add a few more things.
So this hits home for me because when I left consulting after 8-9 years, a lot of these psychological traps that you fall into, I kind of felt, not strongly because, I'd been building something on the side and I knew I was going to get out. So, there was a period of like 3 or 4 years where I knew this wasn't going to be my career. Having said that, you still numb yourself with illusions of grandeur beyond the corporate life without the skin in the game to make that a reality. What do I mean by all of that? Is a lot of people you'll see in the corporate world will say, oh, you're so lucky you have your own business, or, oh, I'd love to do that. Or, they're making money online. Oh, I'd love to make money online the way you're doing it, but I just don't have the time, or I have this really specific skill set, but I just don't really know how to get started. Bullshit. All of it's bullshit. Because you don't have skin in the game, because you haven't put yourself in a position where you can take those risks, you're essentially just being lazy. You don't have the mental fortitude to go through that process. And a lot of people learn that, in particular, when they get laid off from a job. They realize that the intransigent group in this scenario is the company and not themselves. There's a quote, he says, "A company man is someone who feels that he has something huge to lose if he doesn't behave as a company man. That is, he has skin in the game." He thinks he has skin in the game. The problem is he is being completely entrapped by the notion of loss aversion. And this is the fundamental problem with being an employee, is that you're scared of what you're going to lose because you don't trust yourself in the scenario when you do lose that thing. So the final thing I'll say is, he talks about this notion of the highest status man, i.e. a free man, is typically those who adopt the mores of the lowest class. Those people who they've tried to run away from their whole life. You'll see that the richest people are the freest because they're acting like the poorest people who basically don't have money. Like it's this constant tension between what you're trying to achieve that you get stuck in when you're in the middle.
So he also says, people you find in employment love the regularity of the payroll with that special envelope on their desk the last day of the month, and without which they would act as a baby deprived of mother's milk. You realize that had Bob been an employee rather than something that appeared to be cheaper, that contractor thing, then you wouldn't be having so much trouble. But employees are expensive. You have to pay them even when you've got nothing for them to do. You are buying dependability. And then there's another quote. There's a trader's expression, never buy when you can rent the 3 Fs. What you float, what you fly, and what you... That's something else. And Taleb also touches on, as I gave examples of big tech, Taleb talks about people who had... He says, but the technological revolution that took place in Silicon Valley put traditional companies under financial threat. Companies like IBM had to lay off a proportion of its lifers, air quotes. These people couldn't find a job elsewhere. They were also of no use to anyone outside IBM. Even their sense of humor failed outside of the corporate culture. It's a type of people who, even their friends on Saturday, what are they doing? They're taking their family to another IBM guy's barbecue and they're talking company humor, company jokes. It's like you've fucking lost the entire sense of who you are. And this is why I had so much internal friction in corporate environments, especially in investment banking, where it's the reason I left. As you say, I was like, I was clenching the fist. I wanted to fuck people up, but I couldn't fuck people up for legal reasons, of course. So it's the exact same thing, except I had internal friction and I cut the cord. These guys have remained there for life, and it links a lot to the hedonic treadmill, to the adaptation, to a lot of things. An employee is by design more valuable inside a firm than outside of it. That is, more valuable to the employer than the marketplace. And to wrap up this section, really the best thing is to give an example of the Romans. He says, they would have discovered the risk management strategy relied upon by Roman families who customarily had a slave for treasurer, the person responsible for the finances of the household and the estate. Why? Because you can inflict a much higher punishment on a slave than a free person or a freed man. So I think that was brilliant. And the best way to put it, the best slave is someone you overpay and who knows it, terrified of losing his status. 95% of the employee's mind will be on company politics, which is exactly what the company wants. The big boss in the boardroom will have a supporter in the event of some intrigue. Freedom is never free. I'm just going on and on here, and I can't stop. The question is, what would you like to be, a dog or a wolf? Freedom entails risks. Real skin in the game. Freedom is never free. Whatever you do, just don't be a dog claiming to be a wolf. He says, a dog's life may appear smooth and secure, but in the absence of an owner, a dog does not survive. I mean, you've touched on this. A wolf is trained to survive. Employees abandoned by their employers, as we saw in the IBM story, cannot bounce back. And I've put a LOL here about me at Tesla. There is a category of employees who are not slaves, but these represent a very small proportion of the pool. You can identify them as follows. They don't give a fuck about their reputation, at least not their corporate reputation. There I was, surrounded by highly employable persons, my most unpleasant experience in life, until I switched to trading with another firm and discovered that there were some wolves among the dogs. And I think in our industry, this is people who build things on the side, as you say, and eventually leave to do their own thing, or even freelancing or contracting or indie hacking, essentially something which gives you at least some modicum of freedom or flexibility and running your own book. Is it more stressful? Yes, exactly as he says, but freedom entails risks. And I cried to you and our friends so much every time I've been in the corporate world that the stress of experience I had running businesses in the past is for me way more preferential than the friction that I feel in the corporate world. Would you like to move on now to this? What else have you got for us regarding foul language he talks about in this chapter?
So taking all of the stuff you've spoken about around the employee and how they can or can't have skin in the game, and how you can be a wolf among dogs, and linking back to what I spoke about earlier around how you can actually be free and money doesn't necessarily make you free. The key is how he talks about status in the person when you talk about this book. And he uses the example of those who use foul language on social networks, such as Twitter, are sending an expensive signal that they are free and, ironically, competent. You don't signal competence if you don't take risks for it. There are few such low-risk strategies. Before I let you come in on this, the point he talks about is how manners were originally created by the English as a middle-class domestication technique or tactic. How do you get people to fall in line? This falls again to that whole notion of, being a dog, being a submissive dog. It was a way, he explains, that the British or the English were able to create further domestication of their people. And in fact, he sees using foul language in the right context. It's in his Google Talk, for example, that he says he doesn't like using foul language in his books because he thinks it's unaesthetic, it's not very nice. But actually, he'll use Twitter as the platform on which he'll do that. Why? Because it signals freedom. And it signals this intransigence, which again is a theme that comes up through this book, to what the society and people in the majority want you to do.
Yeah, exactly. In the Google Talk, I think, if I recall, he said, because his books, they may be read by his kids. And he said, the places I never swear, if I recall, around family and in books and places as such, but somewhere like Twitter.
I think he says that in a talk, just to be clear, I think he says that when he's getting interviewed by Naval, as opposed to in the Google Talk. I might be wrong, but anyway, check all sources.
I think I may have read it in the book as well.
That, I think, brings us to the end of book 4, where he's basically talking about the positives and negatives of having skin in the game, like how you can be constrained by freedom and how you can create freedom, in essence. I think the next book is called Being Alive Means Taking Certain Risks. This is where he starts to talk about the positive side of risk-taking in the context of having skin in the game. So shall we move on to book 5?
So what is this about? So Taleb gives an example. He starts it with being at some party, and there's a guy next to him who's the only one who's not dressed like everyone else, like a douche, basically. The sort of literary sort of club in New York where everyone except for David was dressed like a douche, basically. And so it says, in the end, I found out his name is David Blaine, the magician. And David Blaine did a magic trick of some sort, which Taleb saw behind the scenes afterwards. He had pierced essentially something through his own hand for the purpose of the magic trick. And Taleb says, so the fellow was really making an ice pick go through his hand with all the risks that it entailed. He suddenly became another person in my eyes. He was now real. He took risks. He had skin in the game. And, he also goes on to give an example of Donald Trump, Trump was a failed entrepreneur, even if true. Can actually prop up this argument. You'd even rather have a failed real person than a successful one, as blemishes, scars, and character flaws increase the distance between a human and a ghost. So this is why when everyone was like, what the fuck, Donald Trump is running for president, he'll never win. But to the shock and surprise of everyone when Donald Trump did win, well, part of that reason is this, because he is relatable, he seems real, he seems like a proper human being. People are like, oh, he lost a lot of money, so he's a real person. He has blemishes and scars and character flaws, and he's lost money. He's been bankrupt before. Damn, okay. I'd rather have him than this other guy. So that's another point which people really like, and we can also link it partially to the concept of religion, how Jesus was a risk taker, and he sacrificed himself for the sake of others. That's going a level even higher. A God who didn't really suffer on the cross would be like a magician who performed an illusion, not someone who actually bled after sliding an ice pick between his carpal bones.
I think the main point that emerges from book 5 builds on this, right? So it really is about how equality and inequality work in skin in the game. And you can look at it in the context of, entrepreneurship and employees. So it's very positive that Donaldo, as he calls him, had, even scars from entrepreneurship. Now, he does talk about entrepreneurship in 2 forms. He talks about those entrepreneurs who have skin in the game and those who are playing games. Those that are playing games, he's kind of essentially, referencing back to what we were discussing earlier around venture capital. These people that just want to leave the bag with an investor down the line. They just want to make money and get out, as opposed to creating something valuable. The reason I raise this is because he's talking about where and when skin in the game can actually be valuable in terms of risk creation and risk taking. He says that the people that are most resented by Americans are not the wealthy who have made their money through entrepreneurship. It's the wealthy who have made their money by being employees. So if you think about a CEO who makes, the Bob Rubin trade, a CEO that makes $120 million, that person is ultimately more hated because they really didn't take any risk. And in fact, they shifted the downside risk to society. That's why typically people dislike them more. if you think about the Europe versus the US, in Europe, the majority of wealth is held by heirs and, family members, where one person would have been super rich. And that wealth was passed through time. I mean, the Rothschilds come to mind. Aristocracy comes to mind. But he also says, for instance, only 10% of the wealthiest 500 American people or dynasties were so 30 years ago. More than 60% on the French list are heirs, and a third of the richest Europeans were the richest centuries ago. So what he's essentially saying is that inequality and equality is fundamentally a dynamic system, where he gives the example, which is here, around wealth and resentment. Dynamic systems mean things change all the time. Rotation is key in dynamic systems. So in the US, the reason the US is really good for risk-taking is because the system enables you to have full skin in the game. And when you have full skin in the game, if you're poor, you can become rich. If you're rich and you don't maintain skin in the game, you can become poor. So the system is always changing. And that's really beneficial because it means that equality is created when you have skin in the game. The last thing I'll say is, he says the way to make society more equal is by forcing, through skin in the game, the rich to be subjected to the risk of exiting from the 1%. So bearing the fruits of downside risk is as important as bearing the fruits of upside. So this is the exact point around symmetry and why it applies in the context of skin in the game. He also discusses, I don't know if we want to go into detail around the intellectual yet idiot in this section.
Of course.
Which we've talked about a lot in previous podcasts. But he gives a full chapter to this in this book. It's short, but it's brilliant.
Yeah. So the intellectual yet idiot, or as he calls the IYI, gives an example on where to find a coconut. The problem is the one-eyed following the blind. These self-described members of the intelligentsia, air quotes, can't find a coconut on Coconut Island, but they aren't intelligent enough to define intelligence, hence fall into circularities. Their main skill is a capacity to pass exams written by people like them, or to write papers read by people like them. Some of us, not Fat Tony, have been blind to their social incompetence, with psychology studies replicating less than 40% of the time, dietary advice reversing after 30 years of dietary fat phobia, macroeconomics and financial economics. It goes on and on and on, which all of these are scientifically worse than astrology. And he talks about the reappointment of Bernanke, or Ben Bernanke, which he also despises. Ben Bernanke in 2010, who was less than clueless about financial risk as the Federal Reserve boss, and pharmaceutical trials replicating at best only a third of the time, etc., etc. The intellectual yet idiot is a product of modernity, hence has been proliferating since at least the mid-20th century to reach a local supremum today, to the point that we have experienced a takeover by people without skin in the game. The IYI pathologizes others for doing his things he doesn't understand without ever realizing it is his understanding that may be limited. He thinks people should act according to their best interests, and he knows their interests, particularly if they are rednecks, or from the English non-crisp vowel class who voted for Brexit. One more. He says the IYI subscribes to the New Yorker, a journal designed so Philistines can learn to fake a conversation about evolution, neuro-something, cognitive biases, and quantum mechanics. He never curses on social media. He speaks of equality of races and economic equality, but never goes out drinking with a minority cab driver. Again, no real skin in the game, as I will repeat until I am hoarse. The concept is fundamentally foreign to the IYI. He believes that GMOs are science, that their technology is in the same risk class as conventional breeding. This is much like a lot of the techies and tech bros in Silicon Valley who are all about these fucking GMO, these man-made meats and all this horse shit. Typically, the IYI gets first-order logic right, but not second-order effects, making him totally incompetent in complex domains. And the last one, I have to say, this is the best. I've saved the best till last on IYI. When in the United Kingdom, he goes to literary festivals and eats cucumber sandwiches, taking small bites at a time. So the reason this made me absolutely piss myself, I've written here, brilliant what Ali Carpet's dad says about the English. Ali Carpet's dad, let me tell you a story. Ali Carpet, who is also known as Tehran Tony, or the Iranian version of Fat Tony, our dear friend. Ali Carpet's dad, you know, man of fine taste when it comes to food. And what do I mean by that? I mean, he enjoys a perfect Iranian meal, a Turkish barbecue, you know, eats like us, eats real food, none of this Michelin star bullshit. And he once said to me, I think we were all together, me, him and Ali, and he said to me, you know, these English people, they eat a little sandwich, and he says they're eating it for half an hour. It's a tiny little sandwich. What are you eating? And then us Iranians with like 5 kilos of rice, you know, royal food. You've got all the meats there. You've got the salad. You've got all these things. So the English go, so he himself is so wise that he is senior Tehran Tony. He was referring to the IOIs as an example of the English. So I had to throw that one in there.
So there's a couple of things. The first thing is we haven't mentioned Fat Tony much because he actually kills off Fat Tony at the end of Anti-Fragile. Yep. So we don't see him, but you can still he says you can still learn the things that Fat Tony believes to be true. And in fact, the whole of Skin in the Game as a book is how Fat Tony acts in real life. So it's like the real world implications of being anti-fragile in the context of being Fat Tony. The second thing I'll say is, when it comes to intellectual yet idiots, he says, to conclude, the intellectual yet idiot knows at any given point in time what his words or actions are doing to his reputation. But as a much easier marker, he doesn't even deadlift.
that was the best one.
That's the best one. And the reason it's the best one is because it basically puts into a very summarized tiny bit of, like a small paragraph into 2 lines, exactly what you'd expect an IYI to do. So it's like he brings it to life for you. There's one important point that we need to close out book 5 on, and that is this point around him building on freedom and agency that we saw in the previous book. In this book, he says you can define a free person precisely as someone whose fate is not centrally or directly dependent on peer assessment, Why is this important? Is because he says that IYIs, where they kind of fall over, is that they only respect quote-unquote experts. They only respect who they see as their peers, which is the main problem he sees in academia. It's this whole point around you come up with complicated solutions, but don't think about consequences, nor do you think about outcomes or results. This is this whole point again around Platonic ideals that he introduces in Fooled by Randomness and practice versus theory that we spoke about in Anti-Fragile. Why is this super important? Is because the IYI tends to be that person that is a bullshit vendor without realizing they're a bullshit vendor. And that makes them fucking dangerous because they will care about what they say, but because they don't deadlift, because they don't put their body under hormetic stress that we spoke about in Anti-Fragile, they are unable to understand where they're going wrong. So you have this thing that they're doing is wrong and they have no skin in the game and they don't understand they're doing something wrong, which creates this absolutely dangerous individual.
Taleb himself, I think one of the prior episodes we did, one of the prior books in the inserto we read, may have said something along the lines of, you know, the best books are those that essentially are saying kind of what you've been thinking or feeling, but you haven't really been able to articulate it yourself or express it yourself. Even now when I read these, the reason I'm going wild and crazy and really enjoying this, it's still hard for me to put into words. This IYI point, I resonate with this so much with regards to experiences in, let's say, again, the corporate world, which I never shut up about because a lot of skin in the game is, you know, you're using those examples as non-skin in the game. And exactly what you said, these IYIs, or should I say, these are the types, the pompous pricks who in corporate world, the Etonian, Oxbridge types or whatever, here's my degree on the wall, they don't deadlift. They definitely do not deadlift. They just do a lot of fucking marathons and horse shit like that. Or they go to the JP Morgan run every summer, do 5.6k or whatever it is. For lunch, they go to Pret a Manger or Eat in London, and they get their little triangle cucumber sandwich. And they probably consume barely any calories, but then 6 p.m. hits, all the calories then become beers or drinks. Or if you're talking about the private equity, more senior investment banking industry, then it just becomes your Mayfair members clubs or all this bullshit. So these people are completely, as we started the book, we said people who are not touching the ground. These are the people they're not only not touching the ground, I'd say they're in another universe altogether, not even another galaxy. So avoid is the conclusion, I would say. And make sure you do your deadlifts. Thanks.
So that's us wrapping up the point on intellectual yet idiots and the inequality problem that sits in this book, in book 5. There's one last thing that he introduces in book 5, which is Lindy. So we've already spoken about Lindy on the previous episode, the Lindy effect. And we kind of go into a lot of, I think we spent like 45 minutes on the previous episode discussing what Lindy means. But to recap, for non-perishable things, however old something is, you can assume that it will remain in the future for as long as it has been around for in the first place. And he gives further examples around how Lindy is something that essentially ages in reverse. Its life expectancy lengthens with time, conditional on survival. And the reason he brings this up is because when he's talking about equality, inequality, having skin in the game, the concept has to apply in a Lindy sense as well. You can't look at these things in and of themselves. So the concepts that he brings to the fore are all interlinked. And this was one of the aha moments for me in this book, where I was like, okay, the reason he introduced Lindy and anti-fragile is that when you then apply anti-fragility in the real world, which is what skin in the game is, you see how important the environment and domain is, and how important having soul in the game is when it comes to Lindy stuff.
Exactly. And as you say, we've touched on it a lot in the past episode, but just to spend a minute or two on it here as a recap. Also around asymmetry, what does Lindy have to do even with asymmetry? He says, that which is fragile has an asymmetric response to volatility and other stresses. That is, will experience more harm than benefit from it. So, the idea of fragility helped put some rigor around the notion that the only effective judge of things is time. By things, we mean ideas, people, intellectual productions, car models, scientific theories, and, drumroll, books. So, exactly, if something has been around, let's say 50 years, the chances are it will be around for another 50 years. Here we go with the point around books, right? So, this whole why we do what we do, every episode we explore a Lindy book and find ideas that you can use, whether it's in life, business, whatever, ideas that you can apply to modern day. But it's Lindy ideas, right? Ideas that have lasted, ideas that have either lasted, so, okay, the inserto hasn't been around for hundreds of years, but the ideas are Lindy. And so the reason I think this is very important is because everything else, most podcasts, most things you read, most of this shit is just meaningless. You read it, your time is limited, and then it's completely useless a year from now, or no one comes back to read it or listen to it. It says the idea of the Lindy effect is it's itself Lindy proof. The pre-Socratic thinker Periander of Corinth wrote more than 2,500 years ago, use laws that are old but food that is fresh. Likewise, Alfonso of Spain, nicknamed El Sabio, the wise, had as a maxim, burn old logs, drink old wine, read old books, keep old friends. It's pretty much it's how I like to live my life. So, or as Drake says, no new friends, but Drake's a fraud. So,
just one more thing on Lindy. In the previous episode on anti-fragility, we touched on Lindy, but explained why it could be referenced as advice that you would have got from your grandmother being better than advice you'll get from intellectual yet idiots.
Yes,
and he gives a couple sections in this book around the grandmother versus the researchers. He says, if you hear advice from a grandmother or elders, odds are that it works 90% of the time. On the other hand, in part because of scientism and academic prostitution, just to take a quick break, scientism versus science is this point around creating false narratives on the basis of research that doesn't actually make sense, that IYIs love to use. But he says, in part because of scientism and academic prostitution, in part because the world is hard, if you read anything by psychologists and behavioral scientists, odds are that it works at less than 10% unless it has also been covered by the grandmother and the classics, in which case you would say, why do you need a psychologist? And then he goes through a list later on called A Brief Tour of Your Grandparents' Wisdom, where he gives a list of all of the core concepts that we've spoken about across all of the different podcasts, and he talks about across all of the different books. But that's quite useful if anybody wants to go and do a deeper dive into Lindy and the specific wisdom points he raises.
Perfect. I think we're ready to move on to book 6. And remember, there are 8 books within Skin in the Game. So book 6 is called Deeper into Agency. So if you remember, we touched on agency earlier, but here wants to go even deeper. The point Taleb makes is, to kick this chapter off, is surgeons should not look like surgeons. And I'll give a quick summary here. He says, if you have the choice between 2 surgeons, one of them is extremely polished, well-groomed, maybe handsome, tall, athletic, hair slicked back. He has his Harvard degrees on the wall, Harvard Medical School or whatever. I'm paraphrasing or giving examples here. And then you have another surgeon who looks like a complete butcher. Maybe even looks like an Iranian uncle, a bit hairy, greasy, balding, probably smells of like kebab or something, or saffron, who knows. And he's like, which one would you choose? Let's say even it may be a critical sort of surgery or operation. Which one would you choose? Well, most people probably say, oh, okay, well, obviously the guy who looks polished and he's got his Harvard degree on the wall. Taleb's like, no. You pick simply the one who doesn't look the part. Conditional on having made a sort of successful career in his profession, he had to have overcome in terms of perception a lot more, had to have much more to overcome. If we are lucky enough to have people who do not look the part, it is thanks to the presence of some skin in the game, the contact with a reality that filters out incompetence, as a reality is blind to looks. So, this is why you should go with the surgeon that looks like a butcher, because he had to overcome it a lot more. So clearly that is the wise decision to make. But society, unfortunately, or in many industries, is based more so on perception, which is, I guess, another fallacy or weakness of humans and their biases.
I like this book and the chapters that sit within this book because mostly of the examples he gives, as opposed to what he's speaking about. Because he touches earlier on in the book around the principal agent problem, you kind of understand a little bit better when you get to this section what he's talking about. But he also reintroduces the green lumber fallacy, which we spoke about in the previous book in Anti-Fragile, around this point of, it's what you don't see, it's the hidden details that are most important. Typically, those things are revealed by time, which is the ultimate stressor, and that therefore is Lindy. Don't fall for narratives, etc., falling for the narrative fallacy or the ludic fallacy that we've spoken about across all of our previous podcasts.
So yeah, in this same book, or book 6, which we're going deeper into agency, he also has said something else, which I realized again. Naval gets pretty much all his ideas from Taleb. But Taleb says, of course, Naval uses his experience to back up the point from Silicon Valley, hearing a lot of fundraising and pitches from founders, right? Taleb says, likewise, the illusion prevailed that businesses work via business plans and science via funding. This is strictly not true. A business plan is a useful narrative for those who want to convince a sucker. It works because, as I said in Prologue 2, firms in the entrepreneurship business make most of their money packaging companies and selling them. It is not easy to sell without some strong narrative. But for a real business, something that should survive on its own, business plans and funding work backward. Yada yada, and goes on. And Naval's given an example of this. He said, when you're hearing of funding, the founder who's very polished, he gives the exact same example, right? He says, the founder who's very polished, who's, got their pitch deck perfectly made, who probably was an ex-consultant or banker, who looks the part. It sounds like maybe they've rehearsed it a lot, but it sounds so smooth, rolls off the tongue, all the right metrics, yada yada. Basically smashes it out the park. He's like, those are actually not the ones you should be funding. Iman's shaking his head if you're listening, because he's like, oh, not another one. Naval took from Taleb. And Naval says, the one you should be funding is the one who's, mumbling over his words. He looks like a mess. He's very nervous, maybe shaking a little bit. There's no real presentation put together. He's like, those are the ones you should be listening to or looking out for more, giving them more funding. So that's another example. And yes, moving on, there is also, he gives a lot of kind of heuristics in this chapter. Another thing that would fail the Lindy effect is food does better through minute variations from Sicilian grandmother to Sicilian grandmother. None of this, let's say, horse shit where you go to a restaurant and he's definitely not a fan of the Michelin star type of bullshit where, I'm giving my example here, but where they put like a blueberry on a plate and you have to finally cut the blueberry and make these weird faces as if like, oh, these are some fine taste and what are we having here? I'm being like Ali Carpet or Tehran Tony's dad who says, these English people eat their little cucumber sandwiches. I'm talking about in banking, we used to go to fucking all these bullshit dinners at these expensive pompous places, which is just horse shit. And there was only one other real guy who'd, grown up in you want to say the ends as well. And after every of these bullshit dinners, we used to look at each other, nod, and be like, all right, Nando's, just because we needed some protein at the end of the day, or like, all right, pizza, or it was a couple of times it was even KFC, which banged when it was midnight in the city, to be fair.
He discusses, I think, is it in this section that in this book that he discusses Charlie Munger as well, where he says, the investor Charlie Munger once said, look it, would you rather be the world's greatest lover, but have everyone think that you're the world's worst lover? Or would you rather be the world's worst lover, but have everyone think you're the world's greatest lover? As usual, if it makes sense, it has to be in the classics, where it is found under the name esse quam videri, which I translate as to be or to be seen as such. It can be found in Cicero, Sallust, and even Machiavelli, who characteristically inverted it to videri quam esse, show rather than be. This whole point around theory versus practice applies to agency as well, and why you need to be able to prove what you're worth as opposed to showing what you're worth.
And another one, he says, real gyms do not look like gyms.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Maybe that you can tell this was probably written around the time he was hanging around with Mark Ripperto and doing a lot of 1 rep max training, because Mark Ripperto says it's a very similar thing in, I believe it's his Starting Strength book. So Taleb criticizes modern gyms that are sort of air-conditioned health clubs, very expensive, and they have all these machines that target one muscle group and you feel like you're exercising. But he says, yet people into strength training, those who are actually strong across many facets of life, know that users of these machines gain no strength beyond an initial phase. By having recourse to complicated equipment that typically targets very few muscles, regular users will eventually be pear-shaping and growing weaker over time, with skills that do not transfer outside of the very machine that they trained on. On the other hand, the simple barbell is the only standard piece of equipment that gets you to recruit your entire body for exercises. Lindy again. Weightlifters have known the phenomenon for at least 2.5 millennia. They even have a swimming pool, some of these health clubs, but no barbell. And so it says, if gyms should not look like gyms, exercise should not look like exercise. Most gains in physical strength come from working the tails of the distribution close to your limit. And of course, this is the 1 rep max or the 3 to 5 rep range with a barbell, a lot of the Mark Ripperto, Jim Wendler style training. So we're still on the same book, but I really want to touch on chapter 10, where he says, only the rich are poisoned and the preference of others, because you know how critical I've been, especially the last few years. I wrote an essay that went somewhat semi-viral maybe 3 years ago on financial minimalism and how a lot of the rich are maybe deluded with their desires, a lot of it mimetic desire, really. So I absolutely this book with so many parts, like the weightlifting part or this part, or what I get so excited. I just like reading and then I'm just highlighting, and then I get up, like it's too much for me to just stay seated. I get up from excitement. He says, when people get rich, they shed their skin in the game-driven experiential mechanism. They lose control of their preferences, substituting constructed preferences for their own, complicating their lives unnecessarily, triggering their own misery. This is a skin-in-the-game problem, as the choices of the rich are dictated by others who have something to gain and no side effects from the sale. And given that they are rich and their exploiters not often so, nobody would shout victim. So he's explained, I think it was in the last book, how, just giving one example, he considers it very stupid people who are into like Rolex watches or expensive things or Cartier watches who get duped into, or like Ferraris or whatever, because Taleb's like, I just got a $60 Timex watch. He's like, and what, bruv? He's like, all of this is horse shit. And then he said, this is the best part because it mirrors something I read or listened to, where he gives a speech in 2016 in American University of Beirut in the commencement speech. He gives a talk, and you remember this, you can get the PDF online, but he says a similar thing here. I once had dinner in a Michelin-starred restaurant with a fellow who insisted on eating there instead of my selection of a casual Greek taverna, with a friendly owner-operator whose second cousin was the manager and third cousin, once removed, was the friendly receptionist. If you remember, even when you tweeted about our, I think it was the Black Swan episode, which Taleb retweeted, and he said, I really admire the food, because in the tweet that you put out, you had a photo of one of our Lindy, Turkish Ocak Basha open fire pits in the middle of a Turkish, I wouldn't even call it a restaurant. It's like some Turkish uncles have opened a little barbecue in the middle of a shop. They're like, yeah, come and have your kebabs. And this is how we like to eat. Or this is why, my somewhat of an obsession with somewhere like Greece or the Mediterranean countries, which are just very authentic. You go into a taverna, you just keep bringing you food. You have some ouzo at the end, like this, same as the Iranian food, right? Or with araq sagi or whatever. And here he's criticizing these pompous pricks of this Michelin star meal. He says, dinner consisted of a succession of complicated small things with microscopic ingredients and contrasting tastes that forced you to concentrate as if you were taking some entrance exam. There was so little that was familiar and so little that fit my taste buds. Once something on the occasion tasted like something real, there was no chance to have more as we moved on to the next dish. Trudging through the dishes and listening to some bullshit by the sommelier about the paired wine, I was afraid of losing concentration. It costs a lot of energy to fake that you're not bored. In fact, I discovered an optimization in the wrong place. The only thing I cared about, the bread was not warm. It appears that it is not a Michelin requirement for 3 stars. So he talks about all these stupid, expensive dinner parties, is Michelin bullshit stuff. All of these are not Lindy, essentially, is the point he's getting at.
It sounds like you wrote this section.
Wrapping up, this is one of those good sections on the same chapter. If anything, being rich, you need to hide your money if you want to have what I call friends. This may be known. What is less obvious is that you may also need to hide your erudition and learning. People can only be social friends if they don't try to upstage or outsmart one another. Very, very good point. And he wraps up this whole section with, I am certain that if pizza were priced at $200, the people with corks plugged in their behinds would be lining up for it. But it is too easy to produce, so they opt for the costly. And pizza with fresh, natural ingredients will be always cheaper than the complicated crap. So as long as society is getting richer, someone will try to sell you something until the point of degradation of your well-being, and a bit beyond that. And to wrap up with my own experience, Americans seem to be a bit more, it's quite cliche to say, but it is true. Americans seem to be a bit more obsessed with this, car, with, McMansion in the suburbs with, multiple cars and all your designer shit, and look at my watch and like my Cartier this and my yada yada bullshit. Being in Europe, or if you want to say flaneuring Europe to somewhat, you realize people live here so simply. For the most part, I mean, you have your pompous pricks everywhere, but for the most part, they live so simply, and there's a freeing element to this. You remember, you were laughing at, you said, my banking phase, but even before the banking phase, you have another period that you guys troll, which is when I was kind of going to Bicester Village in my 3 Series convertible drop top, buying a whole load of designer shit, head to toes, dripped out like a member of the Migos or something. And I went through this phase for a couple of years. I'm so glad I got it out of my system. And now it's just like, all right, just give me like a £20 shirt and done. And like people take the piss out of my, Taleb himself, it looks like he's wearing Gucci loafers. But he says himself, Italian moccasins made in Brazil. Something that's probably like $30 with a $60 Timex. We're not trying to make a point and say, we're saying this as a cope, because that's what some people will probably say in the comments. The point is, I've had quite a lot of the things he talks about. I've been to the Michelin stars, I've dripped out, and the designers with the drop top and all this bullshit. And at the end of it, it's all bullshit. And it's better for you to realize this now if you are, let's say, a younger listener, but you'd be surprised a lot of the older people would even need to hear this as a reminder, that at the end of it is all bullshit. What matters is kind of, I don't want to finish the episode here, we still have ways to go, but as he said kind of at the end of Anti-Fragile, what matters are like your offspring, your kids, your family, the usual cliche stuff, your kids, your family, your wife, the knowledge you've gained, the library you've built, the books you've written, the wisdom you've shared, and experiences with others. So at the end of it, this is all horse shit, and it should not take you too long to figure it out, because Dan Bilzerian, who's known as sort of one of the biggest playboys, or the Hugh Hefner of our generation maybe, he recently came out, I think he's in his early 40s now, he's like, yeah, dude, at the end of this, I've slept with thousands of women, been on all the private jets, he's basically done absolutely everything in the world. At the end of it, there is nothing, and I just want a good woman to settle down with now, Do you want to wrap up this book with what we've mentioned several times in this episode, which is NNT actually gives advice to kids who ask him, what should I do? Do you want to maybe discuss this part a bit, and we wrap up this and we move on to the next?
In chapter 13, he gives an overview of virtues. He talks about the classicists, and he talks about what virtue means. And he says, virtue can be unpopular, and the only true virtue that cannot be faked is courage. So he's setting the scene basically before he gives the prescription that virtue is the most important thing that you need to achieve. But then he gives a paragraph at the end of chapter 13 before he ends book 6 with chapter 14, where he says, take a risk. When young people who want to help mankind come to me asking, what should I do? I want to reduce poverty, save the world, etc., and similar noble aspirations at the macro level, my suggestion is 1, never engage in virtue signaling, 2, never engage in rent seeking, 3, you must start a business. Put yourself on the line, start a business. Yes, take risk, and if you get rich, which is optional, spend your money generously on others. We need people to take bounded risks. And he then describes, what it is to be optimistic, and doing business is always going to help that optimism and help growth. But he then finishes with courage, in other words, risk-taking, is the highest virtue, and we need entrepreneurs. That is important, because what it's essentially saying is, after all of this stuff we've talked about having skin in the game, everything kind of just boils down to being courageous. Everything boils down to, if you speak your mind, and it goes back to this point around if you see fraud and do not say fraud, you are a fraud from Anti-Fragile. The concept of skin in the game is honor and courage. And courage is very, very hard to fake, and therefore it is the best way of understanding whether someone does have true skin in the game. How do you see that in modern society, which is already fragile as fuck, is you create business and you become an entrepreneur yourself, because you're taking the downside as well as the upside risks that could emerge from your labor.
Perfectly put. And I think the only other chapter we'll touch on to wrap up this book 6 within Skin in the Game, he goes back to touch on the Interventionistas a little bit here, which I mentioned earlier in the episode as an example of, since, I don't know, maybe 70 years ago, the Interventionistas sitting in their offices in the West, in their air-conditioned offices, and their assistants or whatever, they're not touching the ground, but they're making decisions that have heavily impacted it. For example, the Israel-Palestine situation for 70 years now. And if they'd just not meddled in it, the situation would have been so different, because Taleb says in most cases, people usually figure things out due to commerce. So doing business together, it causes them to figure things out. And he says, peace from the top differs from real peace. Consider that today's Morocco, Egypt, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, with more or less overtly pro-Israeli governments, with well-stocked refrigerators full of non-alcoholic fermented drinks such as yogurt, have local populations conspicuously hostile to Jews. Compare this to Iran, with a local population that is squarely pro-Western and tolerant of Jews. So on the topic of peace coming from trade, he says, no peace proceeds from bureaucratic ink. If you want peace, make people trade as they have done for millennia. They will be eventually forced to work something out. We are largely collaborative, except when institutions get in the way. I surmise that if we put those people wanting to help, in air quotes, in the State Department on paid vacation to do ceramics, pottery, or whatever low testosterone people do when they take a sabbatical, it would be great for peace. So that's probably the best way to touch on that chapter, if you have anything else to say, and we can maybe move on to the next book.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and go into the final two books of Skin in the Game, Book 7 and Book 8.
So we're back from the break. We've covered 6 books within Skin in the Game. There's Book 7 and Book 8 left. Book 8 is the most important one we'll get onto in a few minutes. Book 7 we'll go through quickly because it's actually fairly short. There's only a couple of key points that you can take away from it. So Book 7 is called Religion, Belief, and Skin in the Game. To summarize, in a Judeo-Christian place of worship, the focal point where the priest stands symbolizes skin in the game. So the notion of belief without sacrifice, which is tangible proof, is new in history. The strength of a creed did not rest on evidence, air quotes, on the powers of its gods, but evidence of the skin in the game on the part of its worshippers. At no point during the emergency period did the drivers of the ambulance consider taking John Paul II to a chapel for a prayer. I believe when he was attacked and was harmed. Or some equivalent form of intercession with the Lord to give the sacred first right of refusal for the treatment. He's like, no. The first thing you do is, in moments like this, you go to the hospital to get treated. While they devote less of their time to what they believe is not religion, air quotes, many atheists engage in yoga and similar collective activities or sit in concert halls in awe and silence. You can't even smoke a cigar or shout buy orders on your cell phone. Spending considerable time doing what to a Martian would look like similar ritualistic gestures. And lastly, he wraps up this with, I think another key point for us to wrap this up with this book is, he says, let us take stock here. There are people who are atheists in action, religious in words, so most Orthodox and Catholic Christians, and others who are religious in actions, religious in words, Salafi Islamists and suicide bombers. But I know of nobody who is atheist in both actions and words, completely devoid of rituals, respect for the dead, and superstitions, say a belief in economics or in the miraculous powers of the mighty state and its institutions. I don't know if there's anything you want to add. I think that's a good summary. But yeah, I mean, in some religions, he gives an example of like the Shia Muslims who, I don't know how you want to phrase it, but maybe they cause somewhat of harm to themselves in some practices, religious practices, where they cause some damage to their own body or something as a form of self-sacrifice to show that without skin in the game, there is no religion as well. But I think that's pretty much it. The most important thing he keeps saying in the entire book, which we'll get to, is book 8, the final book within Skin in the Game, and it's called Risk and Rationality. Do you want to take us away, kick things off with book 8?
Yeah, the reason it's the most important thing is multiple reasons. The first is because I think he says himself in his Google talk and a couple of other talks, if you're not going to read this book and you're only going to read one bit of it, read the final chapter or the final book. The second reason is because all of the concepts of the inserto come together at the end of this, and there's a beautiful circularity to all of his concepts that emerge at the end of this book. And finally, it's really important because it actually makes the most sense, and it makes you realize that everything you've been listening to him talk about in his very individualistic writing style is actually very, very life-changing. Like, the best way I can explain it is it's life-changing. Like, literally, you come away after having read this book and obviously the rest of the inserto thinking, fucking hell, like, I'm glad he ended it like this, because it's just giving me such... it makes you feel good about having gone through the process and oftentimes the difficult process of reading some of his complex work. So the reason it's called Rationality, Risk and Rationality, is because he actually talks a lot about rationality. But the reasoning he gives and the answer he gives to what rationality means is very different to what you'll find in textbooks elsewhere. He says, the only definition of rationality that I found that is practically, empirically, and mathematically rigorous is the following. What is rational is that which allows for survival. Unlike modern theories by psychosophisters, it maps to the classical way of thinking. Anything that hinders one's survival at an individual, collective, tribal, or general level, to me, is irrational. And then he summarizes what rationality is. He says, this allows us to summarize. Rationality does not depend on explicit, verbalistic, explanatory factors. It is only what aids survival, what avoids ruin. Not everything that happens for a reason, but everything that survives for a reason. This is really interesting because it enables us to move the conversation into his most complex theories and the sort of logic and mathematics and statistics that sits behind risk-taking, which again brings everything together again, which is the concept of ergodicity. He only introduces rationality in order for you to create a foundation to then understand where ergodicity becomes important. And if you recall, I'm going to take us back in time a little bit and go back to the first podcast we did on the Inserto, which is on his book, Fooled by Randomness. We spoke about alternative paths, alternative histories in that podcast. We said that outcomes of decisions are not the measure of their correctness. Notice how close that is to his definition of rationality. And he says, a mistake is not something to be determined after the fact, but in light of information until that point. So if you take infinite sample paths, so remember we were talking about all of the different paths that history could have taken. If you take all of them, run them to their logical end, the same outcome will emerge if you run that thing long enough. That was our introduction to what ergodicity was in Fooled by Randomness. But then he uses the chapter 19, the logic of risk-taking, in this final book of Skin in the Game, to explain to us in more detail what ergodicity is. And he breaks it down into two separate factors. What he terms, or what mathematics will term, ensemble probability, that is probability of the collective, versus time probability, which is the probability of the individual. Why do I mention this? Is the concept of an absorbing barrier when it comes to ergodicity and therefore rationality becomes very important here. If you have a collection of Russian roulette players, right? Loads of people playing Russian roulette, and you let that experiment run, you let that sample path run to multiple logical conclusions. The reality is every single day you're going to have all these people play Russian roulette and make you loads of money, right? You'll let that experiment happen because there is no absorbing barrier. You could have every single person die on day one, and then you could still go again on day two because you'll just keep getting more people to run that experiment. That is collective risk. That is an ensemble probability. If you have one person, say your cousin, play Russian roulette one day and he takes 6 shots and doesn't die, would you play Russian roulette the next day? Or would you yourself in this scenario play Russian roulette the next day? No, because the risk of you dying or hitting an absorbing barrier is high, and therefore that is non-ergodic. So what is ergodic is where you have a collective ensemble probability. And then, just to clarify,
it's a key point, by the way. This ergodicity is key, probably central part of this book. So please,
to clarify, that situation in A where you have ensemble probability is ergodic, and B is non-ergodic because B has an absorbing barrier. But that ensemble probability provides you long-term returns because you're able to keep going. Whereas a time probability, one that is dependent on the individual, has too many risks of an absorbing barrier for you to continue with it. So an example I could give you is one that's close to my heart, I suppose. If I'm going to eat a chocolate bar every single day, the absorbing barrier is high. That is a non-ergodic situation because if I run that sample path multiple times to its end, I'll probably die of cardiovascular disease if I'm not doing enough exercise. However, if I have one chocolate bar here or there, it's not going to do anything to my life expectancy because I'm able to manage it, right? And therefore that is ergodic. Same thing applies to trading. If you're going to trade on the stock market, it makes a lot more sense for you to have insurance against your trades such that you never lose more than 20, 30, whatever % of your portfolio in order to create an ergodic situation. So what I'm trying to get at here is that the most important thing when it comes to risk and the most important thing that when it comes to
rationality and risk aversion and loss aversion and all these frameworks that he's spoken about is whether that risk is ergodic for the individual versus the collective, whether it's ergodic for the person or the system that we're talking about. And this is why all risks are not equal. You have to approach risk with very strong specifics around how you're going to treat it. So, for example, you can compare Ebola with Kim Kardashian, and I'd let you explain what I mean by that. But the multiplicative implications of what we discussed in the Black Swan, Extremistan versus Mediocristan, has to be taken into account. The domain in which you operate has to be taken into account when you're talking about risk. So make sure your risks are bounded and ergodic, as opposed to being unbounded and dangerous and leave you in the risk of ruin.
So you're talking here a lot about repeated serial exposure. And if we want to quickly go back to the example of Russian roulette that you said, and we should actually, a key central part of this book 8 is that we will throw up on the screen if you are watching, and maybe we can find a diagram to throw up figure 5 in the book, which is the ensemble probability versus time probability. But essentially figure 5 shows the difference between 100 people going to a casino, as you said. So 100 people go to a casino. Let's say one will get ruined, for example, another survives, etc. You have n observations, 100 observations in this case. So approximately 1 in n will face ruin, but there will also be those who don't face ruin. Whereas time probability, on the other hand, is just one speculator. It's not 100 people. It's not n equals 100. It's n equals 1. And then you're saying, oh, okay, I'm going to go casino. You win once, you win twice. As you said, 5 out of 6 times you may win. So do you go, exactly as you said, do you go back the next day? Fuck no. Because this is where gamblers get fucked and get screwed over. Because eventually you get ruined, but that ruin of yours is terminal. It's essentially, it's wiped you out, which Taleb says, a lot of what he mentioned in his works is, it's saying here, it's rationality is about survival first. So time versus ensemble probability, and in the Russian roulette example, he says, my death at Russian roulette is not ergodic for me, but it is ergodic for the system, and which is, the system is the n equals 100, for example. So I'll move on a little bit to touch on, as you mentioned, Ebola and Kim Kardashian. Where does this even come in? Go on.
Just before you do, the important thing to note is just bringing all these things together. Ergodicity is complex, so the first time you hear this or read this, we don't expect anybody to really understand it. The point that we're trying to get to here, particularly with this final book, is that rationality is misunderstood. Because rationality is misunderstood, what you should think about it as is the avoidance of systemic ruin. So you should never look to be completely ruined. And that which is rational is often what is lasted and survived the longest, which, if you'll recall, links into the discussion with Lindy. And this is what I meant when I said, all of his ideas start coming together, is that it all hinges on this idea of what ergodicity is. But anyway, I'll let you continue with Ebola and Kim Kardashian.
Before I do, let me sidetrack for a second, because it's very important. You mentioned rationality is about survival, but also systemic risk. And so the name of the brand, Rational VC, rational.fund. Now the D cells, who are decelerationist, the supposed self-proclaimed accelerationists will say, you guys are D cells. You're saying it's all about survival. Well, actually, yeah. I mean, the first thing it's about, if you want acceleration, it's first to protect the downside, avoid the risk of ruin. And part of what's interesting as we've been thinking about this is, of course, we have rational.fund on the side. The main focus for now is the podcast, but we've made some investments. You can check out rational.fund to find more. Been in the press a couple of times for investments, etc., with kind of big VCs co-investing. But I think what we've maybe discussed a bit is, going forward, investments should be more so in things, let's say, deep tech or life sciences or defense technology or other technology things that aid survival. Not only aid survival, but prevent systemic risk or mitigate systemic risk, which is, I guess, part of the reason for the name Rational.Fund or Rational VC being so fitting in this case. And also because Rational is about survival. Again, I keep reminding, Rational is about survival, which means the Lindy effect, which is why our book, this is tying everything together. I said since inception, our brand is based on the teachings and philosophies of Inserto series and Poor Charlie's Almanac. And why? Because here we go. I mean, we've covered the 4 books now of the Inserto, minus Bed of Procrustes, but that's just aphorisms. This is tying up the whole Inserto we've done. It's been a long road. We've spent how many, I don't know, hundreds of hours on the Inserto series, preparation episodes, release, everything. And really, this is tying it together. The name Rational VC, yes, partially it's funny, haha, it's an oxymoron that Rational and VC together is an oxymoron. But Rational VC, if we want to get more philosophical and meaningful, how these ideas of Inserto have shaped our brand, I just touched on the survival point. I just touched on mitigation of systemic risk and all these things, and trying to do our best to have courage and live by such values for others. But also, importantly, is the Lindy effect, as I said. So that's why we cover Lindy books on our podcast. We made a decision. Why are we just interviewing another insufferable founder or VC? I mean, the ones we've interviewed are great, but it's important to try and live by such values of the Lindy effect. But going back, that's an important side point. It meant a lot for me to cover that because it explained a lot of what we do. To wrap up book 8, which you've made some phenomenal points, you mentioned Ebola and Kim Kardashian. So all risks are not equal. We often hear that Ebola is causing fewer deaths than people drowning in their bathtubs or something of that sort, based on evidence, in air quotes. This is another class of problems that your grandmother can get, but the semi-educated cannot, or even the IYI. Never compare a multiplicative, systemic, and fat-tailed risk to a non-multiplicative, idiosyncratic, and thin-tailed one. Just consider that, it's impossible for 1 billion people to sleep with Kim Kardashian. Taleb says in brackets, he says, even her. Fucking hell. His writing gets so good in this book, like he just doesn't give a shit. Just consider it is impossible for 1 billion people to sleep with Kim Kardashian, even her. But that there is a non-zero probability that a multiplicative process, a pandemic, causes such a number of Ebola deaths. One may be risk-loving yet completely averse to ruin. The central asymmetry of life is, in a strategy that entails ruin, benefits never offset risks of ruin. And so Taleb also talks here, linking all of this to the Chernoff bound, which can be explained as follows. The probability that the number of people who drown in their bathtubs in the US doubles next year, assuming no changes in population of bathtubs, is 1 per several trillion lifetimes of the universe. This cannot be said about the doubling of the number of people killed by terrorism over the same period. And then that's where he goes on to give the Kim Kardashian example. It's impossible for 1 billion people to sleep with Kim Kardashian, even her. So
yeah, I think what he's getting at there is the difference between Mediocristan and Extremistan, which again builds on the core concepts we saw in the Black Swan around how people who have learnt things in Mediocristan cannot apply the same principle to fat-tailed events that apply in Extremistan. The other thing I just want to pick up on that I really love from this last book is, aside from ergodicity, how he builds on the concept of courage. So he has a section where he talks about courage and precaution aren't opposites. So what he's trying to say is, like, being precautionary, being someone who understands what ergodicity means and the absorbing barrier are, you should still be courageous. You can still be courageous with significant downside risk as long as you are aware of that risk and you understand what an absorbing barrier is. He says, I can exercise courage to save a collection of kids from drowning at the risk of my own life, and it would also correspond to a form of prudence. Were I to die, I'd be sacrificing what he terms a lower layer of figure 6. Figure 6, as we'll pull up on screen and we'll provide a link to, is an upside down triangle. And at the bottom of the triangle, in the smallest nook at the bottom of the triangle, you have yourself. And then as you go up, you get family and friends, you get the tribe, you get the self-defined extended tribe, you get humanity, and then above humanity, you have our ecosystem, which would essentially be like the world or universe. And why I like this is because it says that the further up the triangle you go, so from you all the way up to humanity and ecosystem, the more you do things and you sacrifice things for the sake of those things above, the more courageous you are. So he says courage is when you sacrifice your own well-being for the sake of the survival of a layer, i.e. the higher rungs of the triangle, a layer higher than yours. And I love that because it shows that in order to have true skin in the game, you have to have complete belief in what you're doing for everybody else. It's not just about you when it comes to skin in the game. It is about the collective.
And it sounds very trite, but I've said this in many tweets and past episodes as well, where, you know, I talk about the meaning of life as other human beings, which is what he gets at here with this figure 6. Coming back to rationality again in this chapter, he says, let us return to Warren Buffett. He did not make his billions by cost-benefit analysis. Rather, he did so simply by establishing a high filter, then picking opportunities that pass such a threshold. And he quotes Buffett, the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. And Taleb, a few lines down, says, when I hear someone saying, we need to take tail risks, I know it is not coming from a surviving practitioner, but from a finance academic or a banker. The latter we saw almost always blows up, usually with people's money. This reminds me a lot of, he talks about practitioners here, and this notion of, you know, around survival we're discussing a lot. It's a very Andy Grove-esque, rest in peace, who talks about Only the Paranoid Survive, the title of his book, which I think we'd love to cover at some point on the pod. You know, why did Andy Grove take Intel to such heights? Because a lot of his whole spiel was initially mostly foundationally focused on survival first before you get the rest right. As is the case with most startups, you know, first earn some income to cover the burn, cover the basics, then focus on the other stuff. So to summarize, rationality is avoidance of systemic ruin. A lot of this is about courage. We said meaning of life is other human beings, so being courageous and serving others or taking risks for others. Anything else you'd like to add to this book? Book 8, the final book, and then maybe we can get on to the epilogue.
Yeah, I mean, the bit where he speaks about Buffett, and Buffett says, you know, successful people say no to almost everything, is taking the via negativa rule and applying it here to rationality as well. So every single concept that Taleb talks about across the inserto, you start to see in this final chapter. And I essentially brings everything together around the concept of rationality.
It's brilliant. So I think that's it. Do you want to get on to the epilogue? Maybe close it out for us with the epilogue.
Yeah, we can keep this short. I've got a sticky note here on the epilogue that says, one of his greatest quotes, but that reflects him and how he's aging. And what I mean by that is, he says in the epilogue, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's quite short, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. He says, now reader comes the end of the journey and a 5th installment of the inserto. 5th if you count the bed of Procrustes. So while trying to summarize the book with the obligatory distillation, I saw the reflection of my face in a restaurant's mirror, dominated by a whitish beard and a defiant East Mediterranean Greco-Phoenician pride in aging. It was more than 2.5 decades ago that I put pen to paper for the inserto before my beard turned grey. Lindy was telling me that for certain class of things I had less to prove, less to explain, and less to theorize. I had overheard someone in the restaurant saying emphatically, "It is what it is," and the phrase kept repeating itself in my head. No summary this time, no summary anymore. Per Lindy, when the beard or hair is black, heed the reasoning, but ignore the conclusion. When the beard is grey, consider both reasoning and conclusion. When the beard is white, skip the reasoning, but mind the conclusion. Why is this interesting? He says himself, as he is now closing out the book, that his beard is becoming grey. So actually, if you take what Lindy tells you in that when the beard is white, skip the reasoning, but mind the conclusion, he's telling you to heed this old man's words, but forget about all the reasons I've given you. Just remember that what I'm telling you is right. And this goes back to the grandparents' his reasoning that sits around Lindy, is that you've just gone through his entire inserto series and you've seen his hair go from black to grey to white. heed his reasoning when he's, in the grey period, and really heed his answers when you get to the Whitebeard period, which is his current self. So I think it's him coming full circle and saying, look how much I've aged, but my ideas haven't necessarily changed. My reasoning may have, but just heed what I say, essentially.
And he says, I won't read the whole thing. I'll just shoot off. I mean, it may be a disservice to not read the whole thing, but it's too long. So we may throw it up, but he says, let me finish the book with a long maxim, via negativa style. A few of them I'll throw out. He says, no muscle without strength, no friendship without trust, no opinion without consequence, no change without aesthetics, no age without values, no life without effort, no love without sacrifice, no power without fairness, no politeness without warmth, no degrees without erudition, no friendship without investment, no wealth without exposure, no complication without depth, no fluency without content, and most of all, nothing without skin in the game. And thank you for reading my book. And that's it. That's the Inserto series. I mean, we've still got the Bed of Procrustes episode, but the 4 main books, that's it. It's been a long road. We spend a lot of time on these episodes. We've spent hundreds, plural, literally hundreds of hours. I saw a tweet by someone online on Twitter who said, I've studied 120 plus hours of Taleb. Here are the key lessons I learned. Firstly, Taleb would himself fucking hate that prescriptive drivel. Secondly, it was like the 12 things were all taken from YouTube videos. I'm like, I don't think you've studied Taleb, mate. We've studied Taleb, and even I'm still a fucking pleb. I need to reread these 6,000 times and study them. This is not easy things to... The way we've maybe explained it may sound simple, but even our understanding, I would say, is still limited. These episodes would not do Inserto any justice. In the future, we'll come back to them with, as I said, with improved understanding and life maturity. Every time you study it again, you take away new things. So in the meantime, we're going to do dozens or hundreds of other Lindy books before we revisit Inserto again. It's been a long road. We spend so much time, so please, we don't ask for anything. We don't charge anything. If you want to support us, do a few things. Number 1, go to Spotify, hit the follow button first. And then secondly, rate us 5 stars if you enjoyed it. And also, second thing, go to YouTube, usual stuff, hit the like, subscribe and comment. Let us know what you thought. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, then I guess same thing. Anything else you want to add, Iman? I mean, there's a key thing, rationalvc.com, but I'll let you mention that. And for once, I'll try and... I always twitch to say the domain, but anything else you want to say generally about this podcast, book, Inserto, anything you want to discuss?
Few things. It's been a pleasure to go through the books. It's been a humbling experience, a lesson in humility if you want to understand how much you don't understand about life, about risk, about probability, about philosophy, about history. He knows so much history. When you learn the concept of the anti-library, you learn how much you don't know. So it's been a pleasure in going through that process. It's been a new area for us as well. So we appreciate the listeners and watchers of Rational VC that, don't necessarily agree with everything we say or don't necessarily like the new direction of the show. We still encourage you to engage and be involved because we find that as we grow with feedback, our listenership and audience grows as well. So we kind of learn off each other as a symbiotic relationship at the end of the day. And the final thing is, as you said, if you go to rationalvc.com, we provide a Lindy email, an email that brings to you the core concepts of each book that we read, but does it in not a prescriptive way, but in a way that covers our own experiences. And this is pretty different to anything else that we do, in that it's direct to the consumer and actually helps us grow because we're not reliant on any one platform. So we're kind of trying to get closer to our audience and really learn from them as much as us providing insights to them. So been a pleasure. Please support us by going to rationalvc.com and subscribing. And I'm looking forward to the next book.